A word to the wise. We are an explicit podcast tackling content with adult themes as well as entering spoiler territory if you aren't caught up with us. That would be through all of the currently existing... Well, no, is that true anymore? Through Bands of Mourning. We're done with Bands of Mourning. Right now, that's the end of Mistborn. But by the time this comes out, I think Lost Metal's out now. So, yeah, if you haven't finished Bands of Mourning, stop here and go back and finish that and come join us. Okay, I love you.
Hey there, this is Cross and I love you.
I'm PJ. And
we are Words
I don't know why
Whiskey.
I said that.
I don't either. And we are Words and Whiskey, a podcast for veteran and novice readers alike. We tackle fiction novels and love to talk about what we're drinking. You should think of us as your intoxicating weekly book club.
We're drinking love potions tonight, Crossland. That's what's happening. I think.
Apparently we're drinking love potions in the club.
Mm-hmm.
Is that how it works? Is that what people do at the club? Is that the club?
That's what the club is for. The club is for love potions.
Can I be a part of the club? Can I be invited to the club? Are we going to put chips in the middle?
I'll consider it.
Cut the sandwich into 4 pieces and then put chips in the middle. This brought to you by a shitty rendition of a Mitch Hedberg joke. Or potato salad. Yes. Speaking of, if you've not heard of Mitch Hedberg, go fix that right now. Go to YouTube and go listen to any of the hour specials, but probably, which one's the...
Mitch Altogether?
Mitch Altogether. Yeah, that would be the one. My opinion, I think that's the best of the 3, I think, that are recorded out there. But, yeah.
I think there are some, like, Comedy Central specials, but
yeah,
I want to say that's mostly recycled material.
It is. A lot of it is from Mitch Altogether. Yeah. But yeah, if you haven't heard of Mitch Hedberg, go listen to Mitch Altogether and you'll get a lot more jokes that PJ and I say on the show.
You'll get most of our back and forth banter.
It's true. Okay, cool. With that, today is our 4th and final episode, like PJ said, discussing the Bands of Mourning by Brandon Sanderson, and we are going to chat about 12 chapters, chapter 21 through the end. You can very clearly see how in a very different circumstance, I would have broken this up entirely differently, I hope, right? Mm-hmm. Because, like, this week very clearly has a separation line, and then if you start to think about the other weeks, there was probably one more episode in there. This should have been 5 or 6 episodes, but we're on a time crunch.
This, spoiler alert, if you've decided, hey, I haven't read it, but I'll listen to the drink section and then I'll stop for whatever reason. I'm spoiling it right now, so 3, 2, 1. When Wax dies, I thought that was going to be, like, that could have been, like, we could have had 2 episodes just in this section with that being the split point, and probably talked a lot about both of them.
Yeah. I feel like it would have been cheap to put you out on Wax's death like that, although I can see that cliffhanger existing, just because it's undone so quickly after the fact that it's like, I'd feel a little bit sad. It would be something maniacal that I would do, but I feel like I would leave you instead when, like, Telson shoots him in the back. You know what I mean? Like, he's not dead yet.
Yeah, but was that a different chapter, though? That was the same chapter.
Yeah, no, it's I think, technically, like, 2 chapters before, because of the way the thing's split. Yeah.
Okay.
All of that blends together.
Ending the week on Wax dies would have been hilarious.
Yeah. Right.
Mm-hmm.
But then we would have only had, like, 3 chapters to talk about.
I don't think so. I think it's like 7 or 8.
It's very late. It's 28.
So
okay, sorry, it is 27, which does give us 6 chapters, but 28 and the epilogue are very short. It's not really halfway, though, textually. Like, it's halfway chapter-wise, but, like, word count, there's only, like, 50 words. I don't know. I would feel janky about that one. Okay. Only because it's undone. It always feels bad to leave you on something that becomes undone, if that makes sense. It's like dramatic blue balls.
Crossland from 2 years ago.
I did that in 2 cases, maybe. We ended on some brutal things. The one we can't talk about, but I would head nod and say, like, okay, fine, I'll give you that one. But, the other one was Pierce leaving us on a cliffhanger that I can think of.
That's true.
Anyway, okay, moving on. Let's talk about what we're drinking. We got to talk about what we're reading.
Mm-hmm.
What are you having?
I don't have a name for it, and I'd like you to help me.
Tiki bullshit. What?
It is tiki bullshit, but it's weird tiki bullshit. So it is 2 ounces of rum.
Okay.
1 ounce of green chartreuse.
Okay.
Half an ounce of green chartreuse. Half an ounce of grenadine. Half an ounce of simple syrup. 1 ounce of lime juice. All flash blended.
A monk's vacation?
That's absolutely already a thing.
Is it?
I'm sure.
Monk on vacation?
And I'm sure it's also green chartreuse.
I'm sure. Yeah. No, I'm not seeing anything there. I think you're okay. I think Monks on Vacation hasn't been taken.
Monk on vacation or monk on break.
Monk on break.
We'll go with monk on break.
Monk on an airship? I don't know. Monk on break, I think, is better.
Okay.
Sounds tasty. How's it taste?
I mean, exactly like it sounds. It works well. It's solid. A little bit herbal, a little bit sweet. I think I probably would have added some bitters. I think I would have gone for. I wish I would have gone for like an overproof rum or a higher proof rum just to make it, or not necessarily higher proof, but a more standout. Like do a Jamaican rum that really, really punches. Whereas this, it's just listed as a Caribbean rum, so I'm not sure exactly what the origin is, but it's pretty mild. It's good, it's solid, but it's pretty unassuming in standout flavors. The grenadine's entirely lost. I probably would have omitted the simple and just gone with the grenadine to cut back on the sweetness. More lime, maybe. I don't know. There's a lot of tweaking that I think it needs. It's fine. I like it, but it's nothing spectacular.
Well, next time you'll come back with the Copper Mind or something like that, and it'll be a different take on the same thing.
There we go.
I mean, it sounds like you've got all the ingredients for something really tasty. It just didn't quite iron it out on this go. Yeah, exactly. What are you chasing that with?
I can't remember if I've had this one on the show before, but it's also from Lua Brewing Company, which I had last week, and it is Baby Blue Sedan.
I don't think you did.
But I remember boysenberry, raspberry, blueberry, plum sour. Maybe I did. Maybe I did have it. I can't remember. But
no,
yeah,
I think you just told me about it.
That could be.
Yeah.
Whatever it was. But Lua out of Des Moines, Illinois. Or not Illinois.
Love Des Moines.
Nice pastry sour. So, or not pastry technically, but almost. It's a thick, sweeter sour.
Thick, sweet, sour. Cool.
Mm-hmm. It's exciting. Crossland. What are you sipping on?
I'm having something kind of similar, to some degree. We both went in the chartreuse direction and the monk direction as such. This is actually a known cocktail, so this is a quantified cocktail called the Spanish Monk from the 1950s. So what this is it's 1.5 ounces of gin, a half ounce of green chartreuse, 3/4 ounces lemon, half an ounce simple with an egg white in it. You dry shake it, and then you do a wet shake, cold shake, of course, just to get that emulsification going on, get that texture. Super tasty. I made it with the Luna Bloom gin. So versus the usual like greenish hue that it would have, it's like it looks like blue milk from like Star Wars,
that's pretty
cool.
That's like lavender colored almost.
Mm-hmm.
More gray blue.
More of a gray blue, yeah. I almost called it something violet because it does taste. I imagine it tastes very similar, but the Luna Bloom is like an Empress gin, so it is slightly different. It's a little bit, I wouldn't call it sweeter necessarily, but it feels like a different herbal mixture than like End of Days Usual or anything else, but nonetheless, Still very tasty. Following that up, I'm having Dance Juice from Fonta Flora Brewing out of Charlotte. I had this when we were recording Tales of Conda the other day, but very good, unfiltered, double IPA, fermented with local peaches and dry hopped with El Dorado, Mosaic, Montica, and Sabro Cryo hops. So many hops.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm excited to maybe someday visit.
Yeah, maybe someday. We've only been recording the show for how long, and you haven't made it out here yet.
Yeah.
But I've been back
a couple times.
5 times, 6 times. 5 since we started recording. 1, 2, 4 times.
Sure.
Maybe 5. We're between 4 and 5, but yeah, I'd have to nail down those dates. Anyway, cool. All right.
Perfect.
Okay, so we talked about this a little bit, but PJ, before we talk about the chapters, how do you feel about this week's reading and, I mean, this book, kind of, since we're done?
I mean, this week's reading gets pretty wild. This is his thing. Talking. This is his thing. I get that this is his thing. So fucking much happened. And we get a lot of rules. We get a lot of clarifications. We get a lot of twists and turns and double crosses. And it is exciting and intriguing. And I don't know. I enjoyed it.
Yeah. Okay. I mean,
I think last week is still my favorite of this book, but this week is very good. There are some points where I wish it was more fleshed out. Like, I wish we had more time and more clarification, but instead we just get the high level information dump. But that's just a couple points.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot to be said about the approach to these novels and making them punchier and quicker, and how that sometimes puts other things, you know, at its feet to make it kind of feel like almost an episode of the week sort of format is kind of the way that I would put these books, which nothing wrong with that, but it yields a very different result in the end. But I don't think he goes so far as to undermine himself with any of the choices that are made, which is a plus.
That's true. There are just some things I wish we had more explanation on, like the set in general.
Yeah, I mean, that seems like a great thing to talk about as we go through this here, but I think that is very clearly a mystery that's being teased for the final novel. So
that's fair.
Yeah. Episode of the week, they're getting you on that hook. Now, if you read this book for the first time 6 years ago, you've been on that hook for a long time. You may have forgotten that hook was there even.
You've been dangling.
This was due, I think, technically in like 2018 or something like that, 2019 originally, for when he thought he was going to get to it. But instead, he went back to back on Stormlight Archive books. So, with a couple of other novels in the middle, but, you know, because he writes so damn much. All right. With that, we've got a lot to talk about this week, so we're going to get into our breakdown here. So starting it off, we have chapter 21. We open this week back on our ship, and with Alec giving advice on the inner workings of how these things propel themselves. We see that a big shove gets the whole process started, and then everyone makes themselves lighter by storing their weight in one of these metal mines. It's kind of a fascinating moment that also gives us a taste of his own culture through the respect and reverence with which he treats Wax, just the constant use of the other names and like coming up with a new one each time. Even at one point says that he's not very good at this, which is a nice little comedic beat. But before he can get off another compliment, however, he, Wax, jumps out of the ship, scoops upstairs, and flies back, leaving the horses behind. And it's one heck of an opening scene for the week. Like, this is a big fucking chapter as well. Like, there's a ton that happens, there's a ton to explore, and a lot shifts very quickly.
I mean, just fuck the horses then, I guess, right? Like, they've lived a certain lifestyle, and now you're just going to make them go live on their own in the wilderness? It's bullshit, man. I so deeply love this ship and want to be on it.
The Wild.
Yeah, I don't think that comes as much of a surprise that this like weird, cool technology is something that I'm gravitating towards. But if it is surprising for you, there you go. It's true. I thought I can't remember if I felt this way the first time I read through this, but Alec's reverence of Wax, I mean, it's entirely false, right? Here. But it doesn't necessarily seem that way right away. Like, that facade drops off pretty quickly. That, like, it's an obligation for him to address him this way, but he finds him fickle and doesn't actually, like, hold respect for him as a person.
Oh, yeah. I guess, like, he has no reason to be giving out these titles, and it almost seems like a religious, quasi-religious sort of thing, or a cultural thing. And, you know, it's not as though as I imagine it, there's a lot that we have to unpack about this society, and I think we get to do that next chapter when Marcy kind of has a larger conversation about it. But one of the big things is obviously the fact that allomancers are much more rare among the other Scadrians, among these masked folks, that they are revered because they would ultimately have to have like metals given to them for them to store, you imagine, and as such that leaves them in a very important place in society. And you can imagine, I don't know, I imagine like some sort of quasi priesthood, although they probably aren't that self-important. They're probably raised to feel that important, but like not, I don't know. It's an interesting thing. And so I think Alec in this moment can't keep up the facade because it already is a facade for him because he doesn't fully believe. But then at the same time, like Wax hasn't stored any metals or done anything for, his society necessarily. So like, why continue with that sort of proclamation?
Right. Yeah.
Versus in the end, he kind of gets embarrassed when he learns that Marcy is also a metallic one, a metabolic one, however many different ways.
Well, how many of them, like Wayne as well, he probably doesn't realize.
Well, he eventually does when Wayne opens up about it, but
right. But I mean, right away, it's just Wax that he is aware of. But who else in that group is?
Just the three of them.
And
technically, like Milan is not the same. So
Telson kind of. Not naturally, but...
Well, we don't know that, though. Like, that's not revealed,
But it is making me wonder about the interactions of these technologies. Like, could you embed... Like, could you create one of these pieces of... One of these grenades, whatever you want to call it, through hemalurgy?
That is very separate from what I was talking about. That is a question. We were talking about the religious reverence, and I like, while I agree with you that that's interesting,
but by extension, then hemalurgists would be just as important and maybe just as revered.
Maybe. I see where you're going. I think that they said that was a bad thing at some point along. I'm pretty sure that he made some comment about like that being bad. I'm not 100% on that. I don't
recall that.
Remember. But I thought that he had reacted negatively to the spikes at some point because it was a bad way of going about giving people powers because like you're diminishing it by doing that.
Okay.
So
I can't recall.
Yeah. Regardless, I don't know. I don't think so. I mean, maybe is the best I can give. Yeah.
All right.
The other one, there's a pretty clear-cut line to. There's like a moral question there that we don't know, like how they actually value morality outside of survival. So as a tenet, so we don't really have a picture of their society outside of this very limited scope.
Right.
Cool. So we go to Telson, and there's a ton to say about her over the course of this week, but she's giving us plenty of information about Edwarn and directing us to our eventual destination of that second location and the weapon that we chatted about last week. The mythical Bands of Mourning. This comes up later in conversation as well, but what'd you make of Telson upon initial pass? I mean, when you first gave this a go? Were you shocked? Were you analyzing her actions? Where were you at?
First pass, I can't recall.
You gotta write these down, man, because that's got to be that. Those are interesting takes.
I know. But like there was a point where I was suspicious of her, but right away, I think it was like I took her at face value. I just don't know where that cross happened. I think I wrote it in the notes somewhere that I can't recall because there's so much like hindsight. There's so much in hindsight and on second reads, but all of the information that she's giving is good, even with our like understanding that she's a mole, I guess, at this point. All the information's still good, which is pretty true of everything that Edwarn always says to Wax as well. It's very rarely a time where anyone's outright lying to Wax. So I find that to be interesting that it's true across both of those characters. But I don't know.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it is interesting because the characters are never liars, which is, I mean, not They're withholding truth, which is in and of itself its own form of, it depends on the person, but it's its own form of lying. And it is a very clever way of making those sort of things line up perfectly, because like she wants to go there. Still, she wants to go see the weapons, and she sees potentially her uncle outmaneuvering him. When in reality, but in reality, the smartest thing to do is not to bring. Why would you bring Wax there? Why wouldn't you like let Edwarn figure it out?
Unless she really doesn't care about Edwarn at all, and she's just using Wax as a means to get to the bands.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if she thinks that he has some kind of important information, but we know that he doesn't really have anything that's unique over the lead that Edwarn has to get here,
No, but
plus Edwarn has the key to get in, and he has the ability to get in because to me, there's a big flaw in Telson's plan versus just going and turning him.
She doesn't need him.
No, she doesn't need Wax at all. The set don't need Wax. Matter of fact, they've said many times that he's more of a problem and a nuisance, so why would you bring him close?
Unless it's the closeness to... Well, they joined up before they got close to Alec, so that's not really a motivator. It could just be...
I think Alec ultimately is the reason that everyone settles on going in addition to the other pushes, because there's chance that the crew is there and other... I get why the people end up going there. My question is, why didn't Telson push against it? Because it feels like there's a very natural point for her to... an egress here for the set to be set up to do things successfully in the future, and...
To take the ship, maybe?
But Wax... he's there to take the ship anyway. Edwarn is there,
I mean, the ship that they're on.
The tiny one?
Yeah.
I mean, but they have the big... They assume, I guess, the big one is there. But, okay. That is it is the only working ship, so far as we are aware at this point. So, that's fair.
I don't think it's a good reason, but
yeah,
it's a reason.
Mm-hmm.
You're right. That plan does seem very flawed, and I'm not sure what to make of that.
Right. The only rationale that I can make is that she doesn't trust Edwarn and sees this as a potential power move for him to replace her as head of the set or some such.
Which we know he is thinking about.
Yeah, angling to do.
So that could be.
Yeah, that's fair. Okay. I mean, something to ponder at the very least, thinking about Telson. So we move to Maricy's perspective and ponder kind of the 4X view of the sky here as we are in the ship floating over the land, and the interesting intersection between knowing that harmony was real and believing in another faith despite that. It's not that it's necessarily a conflict between the two so much as it is picking the person you idolize, making it more of a philosophical question of sorts. You know what I mean? Like this is kind of a tough thing to pick at, where it's like, I believe that God is real, but I don't care.
Yeah, I mean, I figured you'd dig into this a little bit, because it does scream of philosophy over religion at this point. And they do go hand in hand, and I guess it's not entirely divorced from it, but it's much more of a philosophical question and decision-making process than it is a religious one. But if you believe both are real, you still have to choose one to model your life after, primarily. You can do both. You can take things from both of them, but I mean that there are two existing structures to work within, and it's easier to just choose one of them as opposed to trying to forge your own intermediary. So
yeah, right. We've seen Sazed try to do that. I mean, in the previous story, that was his whole conflict of faith, is either A, finding the true faith, or B, being this intersection of all of these faiths and believing disparate components can work together.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It picks at something interesting, but it doesn't do more in the moment than it knows that almost from Maricy's perspective and from Brandon's perspective, it's like he knows that the scab is there and he wants to pick at it to get what's underneath, but he knows that it may not result in what he wants. It may not be helpful or propulsive for the story in the right way, and so he doesn't pick at it here. But I'll tell you what, I would appreciate a little bit more of an exposit on the thinking in comparison. It doesn't necessarily need to be here in this immediate moment, but you can understand why it's evoked here. I mean, this is a fantastical, revelatory scene for someone who hasn't been able to be up here in the sky.
Right.
It is like the first airplane ride for a lot of these folks.
It's the first, I mean, for our entire understanding of the world and the population. Mm-hmm. That is what it is, you know?
Yeah. Right. So
we always knew there were others.
You know, you did key into that southern continent thing in the original couple of episodes. So
it was explicit. It talked about it.
No, I know. But like it was rather, I said the first couple, you keyed into it. I think it was at the end of the Hero of Ages is when Sazed mentions it, or Vin mentions it when she turns in.
I think
one
it's
or
Vin.
the other.
I think it
might be Vin. Yeah. What's that on the pole? And then there's another line about life at the poles. Life only possible at the poles or something like that. So, which is interesting when you consider that like the thing here is metal and like magnets and poles and life only being possible at the extremes.
Yeah, but magnetic poles and
very different.
Poles are very different. Like ours
yes.
to kind of line up, but that's not necessarily the truth.
Definitely speaking of this more of an allegory metaphor, not an actual.
Gotcha. Okay.
It's an interesting thing to pick at again, but it does not line up with any real scrutiny. Mm-hmm. Much better as a metaphor.
True.
But, of course, Marasi is contemplating these things while feeling like she's on her deathbed as Milan sticks her fingers into her and is healing her with some like absolutely crazy utilization of Khandra physiology. It's something that we hadn't even like speculated on that much up until this point, that there was like potential use here for Khandra to be healers. This is wild, and the explanation is great.
I was so surprised by this. Mm-hmm. Like you said, we hadn't speculated on it. I had no idea anything like this was coming. And the mechanics make sense, which is super satisfying to like be presented with something that's just there and totally makes sense that it works and just never crossed my mind. So I appreciated that. But this is where we get the am I going to die comment, right? Which, good joke. Good joke from Milan.
It is a very good joke. Yeah, you're going to die. And so Marasi resigns herself to death in this moment, even though it's like barely. She's like, no, you're fine. You're just in shock and pain.
No, I didn't mean now. Not today.
Yeah. Right.
Just eventually.
Right. It's a great moment. But then we go to what ends up being a really big chunk of this chapter, where Marasi is conversing with Alec and really splitting this world wide open with various implications here, as well as introducing us to this other society. There's the Sovereign, the society at large underneath him, the tribes, the hunters with the masks that fuse to their face who came before. There's the cold. There's the Catasandra, which is like basically the Ice Age for these people. There is sort of their reverence for the metallic arts as they see them. There's so many different directions to go that we have to talk about, but I guess which direction do you want to run in first?
I want to go into sort of the physiology.
Sure.
Because we got an understanding from the Lord Ruler that he had changed the human physiology to match the changes of the world so they could thrive in those environments. And this tells me that Sazed either couldn't do that or just didn't for these people and allowed them to just be uncomfortable in the now colder atmosphere, which seems weird to me.
I definitely agree with you. It does seem weird to a certain degree. I think that I believe it's even textual that he did change the physiology in the end of Hero of Ages. He altered everyone to be more responsive, to be able to eat the new stuff, and like changed the way that allomancy is given, the way that snapping happens. Like there were a lot of things that shifted at the end here where he messed with people's genetics.
Not their ability to survive in the climate.
Yeah. And my pitch for you on an idea as to why is because he's Harmony, right? He's a combination of ruin and preservation, and so this is ruin one area, preserve the other.
That shifts all of the decision making of Harmony entirely.
What do you mean?
I think because I was under the impression that it was all about it wasn't so segmented like that. Like the point of humanity is that it is a blend of preservation and ruin. Not just like, I'm going to put my preservation over here and my ruin over there.
Oh, no. I'm suggesting that it's a blend, but I'm saying, like, if he's allocating preservation to change the world and to do all of these things and make this dramatic shift for some of the people to set up one society to prosper, he would also be taking that away potentially from somewhere else as a balance on the equation.
I can see that argument. I don't like it, but I can see it.
It's definitely speculation, I'll tell you that. Like, there's no... You are just about as far as I am, so... Got
Tell me that in a few days.
Story to go. Yeah.
I'll be whole book back.
When the Lost Metal comes out. Yeah. Actually, it's out right now, but for everyone listening to this. But, yeah, fair point. Yeah, so, I mean, I do agree with you. I think that it is surprising that they're kind of left there, and then, you know, that they're put through these very brutal circumstances and situations, almost as though they were completely ignored. And
which also pushes against that argument about ruin being placed there. If he's just ignoring them and not changing anything, that's doing neither.
I'm not necessarily saying that he's ignoring them. I'm saying, but ignoring them is they're degrading because he's ignoring them and didn't adjust their physiology. So, like, that is still ruin getting its piece.
He's preserving their physiology.
But they're dying. What? Complicated point. I wanted to bring up, relating to this a little bit, the idea that potentially, this is just another theory, right? Potentially, could those people be considered a control group for technology and development because they've been separate for so long? And so he treats them like a separate control group. He gives one group this, like, flourishing society to see if they push forward, and gives the other one very harsh environmental circumstances to see how they develop.
You think Sazed's doing the scientific method on this motherfucker?
Of course. I think that also is a possibility. I think that is distinctly probable. Yeah,
I could see it. Or they're under the influence of Trell, and he doesn't have the ability to actually make changes over them.
There definitely is something to be said, especially with the way that this ends. And then we also have the perspective. I mean, we're talking about this and we're speculating about things that we do have some answers on as the story continues, right? Just a couple. And there's this note here specifically that we kind of get an answer to in the end, but we'll pick your brain on that specifically when we get there. There's the note here about the Sovereign and the misaligning time frame, 300 years versus 330, which I think it's kind of made a big deal out of as they proceed kind of through this beat and talking about the history of the society on the whole. What do you think about the Sovereign? What's your perspective or thought process on the Sovereign? And who you think they are? I mean, that's a place to start.
Fuck, dude. I think it's the Lord Ruler.
Okay.
There are hints made in that way, and nothing, like, denied. Like, it feels like it's almost confirmed, right? In conversation.
I don't know. Does it feel confirmed to you?
Well, yeah, but I might be misremembering it.
I think there's more to talk about, and I'm excited to talk about it when we get there, but I wanted to pick your brain on the idea, and then when we get to the point, I'll be like, remember when we were talking about the Sovereign? And then we'll start to piece together the other side of what I think the mystery is. I really think that this is a fascinating question, and that in the end, we do get the answer here, and there's a couple of pieces that are intentionally misleading, and our characters key into them as well. That it seems as though this isn't the Lord Ruler, but that this could be Kelsier.
Yes, it could be.
We've got more to talk about, so we don't need to hash that out quite yet. But your initial reaction to
my initial reaction to that would be no, I don't think so. Simply because of the reverence of the Bands of Mourning, the statues of the Lord Ruler,
the statues of the Sovereign.
I thought it was more explicit.
Everyone keeps saying the Lord Ruler repeatedly throughout this section because they all assume it's the Lord Ruler.
Okay.
Right? That's so, like, the book is trying to convince you that it's the Lord Ruler because that's who the characters believe it is for a very long time. They're looking for the Bands of Mourning. They believe it to be these bracers. And then in the end, it's the tip of the spear, right? Is the bands. That's where all the power is. It's the spearhead.
Fuck, dude. I don't know, man. I want to think it's the Lord Ruler, but That's a good point.
All told, I mean, I think that there's definitely something there. If it was the Lord Ruler, that'd be crazy. The Lord Ruler just fades into the background during the Sandre and everything else. He's just like, I'm just going to chill in a village somewhere for a bit. I'll see you guys later. Like, you guys can handle this shit from here on out. I'm done. And then decides to walk south. But more to say on this. We'll talk about this more as we proceed, because there are other components and hints and things that I think point us in that direction. But What about the technology of these metals and the working of the Puck's metal mines and the definitions of investiture, Nigrosil, the interplay here, multiple metals in one metal mine composing, the thing for ferrochemy that allows for this to happen? What do you think of this added complication on ferrochemy?
It's intriguing, to say the least. It's complicated and is intricate, and it's difficult, Understandably, we don't get a super solid framework on all of it, because that's insane. There's so much to it. But I think I'm going to hold my belief that this is entirely a separate metallic art. I know you had made the distinction before last week, I think, separating this from allomancy and ferrochemy and hemalurgy. But this feels very much like hemalurgy to me. Go ahead. Just in the way that it interacts with other metallic arts,
Well, yes. Okay, so I understand exactly what you're getting at, especially when we talk about the bands. The bands become more complicated because they stretch beyond the means here that we assume that we have access to, because these are ferrochemicals strictly, right? And we get a note later on the cube itself, and that's why I was kind of trying to draw the delineation, is that the cube is powered by a different metal, metal, and so that's why that one to me felt like technology, but I couldn't exactly break that down because we didn't know the metal inside of it yet, and sort of the dangers they ran of getting it wet and it becoming explosive and everything else. But this to me still feels like ferrochemy with a wrinkle on it that it requires really good forging technique. So it requires advancement in technology in order for it to become, something more.
It does, but it introduces more mechanics and more powers, more rules.
Does it though?
Why is this different from hemalurgy?
Because it's still using the base rules of ferrochemy.
So is hemalurgy.
Hemalurgy is stealing those abilities. This is just combining them. This is just adding them together.
Allowing somebody else to use them that doesn't have those powers intrinsically.
But that's because of identity, which is a ferrochemical ability. It's a ferrochemical, it is something on the ferrochemical table, and so it is access to that gives that capability. It's not stealing it from someone else. It is someone else putting or emptying the identity from a metal and then having it be blank so that someone else can use it.
But, okay, the identity piece still has to come into play with hemalurgy, though.
Correct. You have to steal someone's identity and put their soul into something. Split the soul, basically.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it's still a separate art.
Correct, because it requires that you take someone's soul to do so. It requires death and blood.
But the powers themselves are the same. See where I'm coming from? I
understand.
It feels like a parallel to hemalurgy that can also apply to ferrochemy.
I think, maybe here's a useful something that I would consider distinguishing. I think that the metallic arts are like three. This is kind of how I imagine it. They're like three periodic tables, right? We've got the allomantic table, of which has some very strict rules. It has the strictest rule set of them all, with just a little bit of bendiness with compounding. That's like its bend factor to some degree. So you've got allomancy as one, you've got hemalurgy as another, and you've got ferrochemy as its own, right? So you've got the three that kind of rotate around. Hemalurgy is dependent on a couple of things. It's dependent on killing someone, it's dependent on spiking the receiving person in the right place, and the time between, as well as some other stuff that hasn't been fully revealed yet. So thinking of them as those separate tables, I think, is really useful. This, specifically when it comes to the pucks, is just multiple. I entirely see where you're coming from, but it is still just ferrochemy. We just now have an understanding of identity.
But why is hemalurgy not just allomancy?
Because
in that regards,
It's not just allomancy, because you have to... So, intrinsically, the magic system is tied to someone's spirit, someone's soul, right? Like, either of the two magics are tied to someone's soul. Hemalurgy bridges that gap by taking someone's soul and then giving it to someone else. The distinction there between that and what's happening here with Nigrosil feruchemy is that they're removing identity from the metal mind to make it accessible to everyone. It's still limited to the feruchemical table. You can also steal feruchemy with hemalurgy. The art of hemalurgy is the metal in which you use to steal, because you have, like, iron steals certain abilities, steel steals certain abilities. You need to use a certain metal to steal certain things from people.
So I guess the thing that would convince me the most, one way or the other, is if a feruchemist also used this with their own feruchemical ability, like how bronze, like Vin's copper or Vin's bronze earring allowed her to do more with bronze because she had both Mistborn abilities and it was expanded upon by the hemalurgy. If there's an expanding of abilities through Nigrosil, if you already have that feruchemical ability, that would be interesting to me.
But that's a thing that hemalurgy expands the capabilities as well if you already have something. It's like a tweak because it's not identical to your own power. I understand what you're saying. The problem with what you're saying is that hemalurgy is an intersection of the arts, right? Compounding is actually an intersection of the arts as well. And this feruchemical ability is just feruchemy. It is strictly, like, because identity is locked in on the table, and that's the complication for me that makes it where it cannot be something else, because it is on its own table. It is defined as a part of it. But it's also one of the metal minds. What?
It's also allomancy.
I mean, in the bands, yes, the bands get complicated and we don't understand why the bands work.
Okay.
That is the one thing. We don't understand why the bands grant allomancy at all, which is where this becomes a giant question mark, where maybe it could be. Yeah. But as described, these pucks are strictly feruchemical in appearance. Fair. That's the thing. Like, you don't need... There isn't some bonus knowledge that would change the way that this interacts, if that makes sense.
Right. Okay.
The only like shift, the biggest shift is like they can only get 3 to work in 1, right? Is one of the big things that he talks about, I think, in the next chapter, in chapter 22. But that prevents, prevents them from going to 4. Which I wonder, because that's also the same breaking point as hemalurgy, with more than 3 spikes can't put in without Harmony's complete control over you. So I wonder if there's something unique about the number there.
Okay.
Some God factor. This is truly speculation, PJ, for the record. We, again, are just about at the same spot. So, like, there's a lot of, like, I've also... Yeah, go. Okay, so we were just off air for a little bit, talking about this a little bit on our own, and we had some stuff to sort out. But I wanted to chat a little bit about something that we had kind of touched on, and you had brought up specifically about the Bands of Mourning. So if you wouldn't mind repeating what you had just said a second ago so that we can use this as a jumping off point.
So I think the fact that the Bands of Mourning seem to follow the same technology and work the same way as these discs do tells me that these discs aren't strictly external feruchemy, but the fact that it applies to allomancy somehow, in some way, makes this a lot more of a complicated system.
So I think, to clarify, the discs are all external feruchemy. They're specifically set as such that they're like 2 layers of metals. They can very clearly see the Nigrosil layer and then whatever the other metal is that they're using. So that's defined, right? So I feel like the discs themselves, as it applies, are feruchemy only. That said, thinking about the bands, I just wanted to clarify because, like, that can get, muddy.
I'm just saying that they're operating under a system that can do more than that.
I think there's an argument with investiture that everything can do more than it appears to on the surface level. So yes, vaguely, absolutely. No one knows the depths of each of these different magic systems. That said, I wanted to posit something that I thought when we were running through this kind of off air, which is we were speculating on how allomancy could be imbued on these, right? And how you could use allomancy with the Bands of Mourning, given its stasis as a spearhead, right? And it came to my imagination that is there a potential that this is a hemalurgic spike and that there are 16 different layers of those 16 metals that have all been stolen and imbued onto the spike to give access to allomancy for the person who's holding it, in addition to feruchemy.
But that changes the way hemalurgic spikes work then.
It's not implanted, which does raise the question of, like, is it because you have hemalurgy and feruchemy working together? Is that why it might work? Because we haven't seen a feruchemical metal mine become a hemalurgic spike, so far as we're aware. You know?
Have we not at all?
I think technically the Lord Ruler has one, but, like, we don't really know. I don't think we have it all, though.
Okay.
There's potential for the Lord Ruler to have had one, but we don't know. But I don't think anyone else has had a feruchemical metal mined spike in them.
Oh, what if...
So could that be?
Miles' 100 lives.
Sure.
What if he had a gold hemalurgic spike?
So we
and
do
used it as a metal mined. What would happen?
I believe the answer there is that he's not keyed to it with the identity, so he can't use it. However, could you... This is where, PJ, this is why the words Brandon exist, is because people have these questions specifically about the magic system and some of the things like this and some of the interactions. And this is why those things exist, which is a big part of the conversation and why, you know, there's some other answers to these questions that have been asked or posed about other systems. And could you use an unkeyed feruchemical metal mined with a different magic system to capture some other kind of magic and, like, use it? And he just keeps raffoing them constantly. So it seems very clear that there's some bullshit going on with the ability to manipulate identity, which seems incredibly important in the long run.
That's crazy.
So that said, I think the problem with what we said is that you cannot burn something that isn't keyed to you, and anything hemalurgic is not keyed to you. It is keyed to the person that you stole it from. And so you cannot burn someone else's soul, basically. You can access it, but you can't burn it. Or it would have a very strange effect. We don't know what that... Like, I think that was the answer that was given, was it would have a very strange effect and we wouldn't know. It might splinter your soul further by tearing into theirs. So...
I want to find out. I really do.
I know. I feel like that's something that will be explored. It seems like one of those very tangible bits to talk about, but... That I guess that's my hypothesis, potentially, unless it's something completely off the wall for the Bands of Mourning themselves. I think that the Bands of Mourning is technically 16 hemalurgic spikes.
Okay. I thought it was 32, though.
Why would it be 32?
I thought there were 32 powers.
There are, but why would it be 32? There's 16 allomantic abilities and 16 feruchemical.
And there are two bands. What? And they think that they were melted into one, but I think there's two. We'll get into that later. Never mind.
The bands, to be clear, are actually a spearhead, right?
No, I think one of the bands is a spearhead.
But we have access to all of the powers in the one band.
All the powers that they know about. There's a lot of powers that we
I understand where you're going with this. Yeah, I understand where you're going with this.
The spike through the eye that Wayne took the spearhead from, I think is the other band.
You think the spike is?
Yeah.
The rest of the statue is wood, except for the belt. I think it was wood. Maybe it was stone. I think it was wood, though. Except for the belt, which was aluminum.
Presumably aluminum.
Yeah. We'll get into why I think it was presumably aluminum, and what we can talk about that in a second. So it's nice that we get this in kind of at the end of the episode before the book comes out and people can all read the book over the 3 days that they're going to have a lead on us in this episode coming out and be like, oh man, those guys were so wrong in XYZ and XYZ and ABC and fuck those guys. I'm never listening to them again. All right. With that, let's get into chapter 22. In Chapter 22, we're back with Marasi, and we get some further explanation as to the working of the translation medallion, as well as some words that just don't function. This is a chapter written for rules. We've already talked about a lot of the rules themselves in the course of the last conversation as that sort of happened, but we also get some other words. We get the word that doesn't translate, Jagenmeier, which seems to also match up and mirror with the story of ruin and preservation that Alec tells a little bit later in the associative gods within their religion. So there's another word here that doesn't translate to God, but it translates to something else.
So what this section does for me, understanding like that accent, well, language, first of all, is tied to location, not culture. Like their language is hard-coded into where they're from. So is their accent in a more detailed way.
Grounded fashion,
Which makes Wayne's ability to mirror accents so much more like rules heavy and intricate and like real. The way he's able to manipulate people into thinking that he's from somewhere because of the accent and how particular he is about them makes so much more sense than what I was thinking to begin with, because for them it is hard coded, and those differences do actually matter on like on a rules level.
I have to go give this dog a treat, otherwise she's going to freak the fuck out. Yes, they do. Absolutely. I think they absolutely matter on a rules level, and I think that that's something that's very interesting. This gets into the very fun cross-world conversation that happens with the Cosmere, but I don't think you technically know enough yet.
Okay.
Damn it. But there's some fun stuff that we can talk about regardless, which is like, if you think about so spoilers for Elantris, skip forward just a little bit here. If you think about the Aeon door, right, it was keyed very specifically on location, and with a specific people of whom have specific abilities. So you've got a key on the dominion that they're over, and then you also have a key on identity because they had to be selected as this people to have like the subset. And that's a very interesting parallel here that happens with this and sort of the way the language works.
Yeah, it does. There's also the Roughs, which have their own accent. And the fact that Wayne slips into that accent, I wonder if it's more meaningful than just headspace. If there's actual like meaning behind his change in accent based on action or based on intention or anything like that. It'd be, I don't have a leg to stand on at this point yet, but I'd like to see that explored more as a mechanic.
I'm gonna go ahead and put it out on a limb. I don't think it's going to be necessarily explored as a mechanic, but I think it does make Wayne an incredibly unique character, where he's able to recognize those differences and then lean into them. Where he can basically manipulate something that is attached with someone's identity, right? Like, we know that identity is so important because it's on the ferrochemical table, and the ability to imitate even superficially someone's identity is useful and Cosmere adjacent as far as the sort of socio-magic system goes.
I'm wondering if it's unique as well.
It does seem to be. I mean, you know,
it's like him and Milan that are able to do it. And then there's Wax and the Roughs accent. So presumably that's just like you pick up an accent when you live there, which is, I mean, how it works, but it's not as written into rules. If he's introducing another hard system,
I don't think so, man. I think that Scadrial is as complicated as it needs to be.
As it needs to be, but as it could be? It could be more complicated.
No, I mean, it can be. Like, I want to break your brain open for just half a second, and you're going to forget this, so it's never going to matter. Minor spoilers for Stormlight. Imagine 12 magic systems. Cool. That's where we're at. So, moving on.
Well, right now we have 3, maybe 4, and if the accent thing comes the way I want it to go, maybe 5.
and I won't say that you're too far off because I think that we have the same assumption to some degree, which is that very clearly Trell has a medal, right?
Yeah.
Very clearly by the end of this, Trell has a medal. We knew that at the end of the last book. It seemed that there was a spike that was outside of the chart. Who's to say that's not another god medal, like Atium and everything else? That doesn't rule it out from being another god. And I'm not suggesting that Trell isn't potentially another preservation. But I do want to delineate that there is absolutely no way that Feruchemy or Allomancy are anything but preservation. Hemalurgy is absolutely ruined. There could be another magic system from Trell. I'm not going to discount that. That could be real. But it is neither Allomancy nor Feruchemy. Those are very clearly and closely tied. Textually.
Fine. All right, let's keep going.
But that one's very clear. Okay, so Jagenmeyer. Do you have any thoughts on what Jagenmeyer could mean before we completely move on? Obviously, we think it's kind of a stand-in for God.
Jagen. I don't know. I'm trying to draw from like Norse stuff, but
I think that's entirely real to pull from.
I don't know it well enough to make those actual like extrapolations. So
that's totally fair. I don't think it is supposed to be direct, but it's obviously evoking Norse ideology a little bit. I love as well last week that you said Russian, or like you basically leaned in with him saying that he has a Russian accent. And I didn't have time to listen last week.
I don't think I did. I thought I said he had the same accent as the Obsidians, which is Scandinavian.
Oh, you may have. I might be misattributing that. For some reason, I thought that you said Russian, and I was like, It is. I could
have said that by accident, but like I was trying to make the connection to the Obsidians.
That could be it. You may have said Obsidian and then Russian, and then like it's kind of like Russian or whatever, and then you breezed it off and moved into the next thing. And I don't think I commented.
I mean, Scandinavia and Russian. Like they're right next to each other.
They're similar. They're similar, but very harsher languages because they don't share language roots. But
they don't. Yeah, they don't. But
well, they do. And
their people are.
It's not Germanic.
Similar.
Right. Well, cold.
I mean, in culture,
cold-hearted, and yeah. Speaking of, if you are Scandinavian listening to this, hi, I am also fairly Scandinavian. PJ is also fairly Scandinavian, but we are Americans, so we escaped the frigid north, and PJ still chooses to live in the frigid north. Actually, he just moved to a different frigid north than his family did. So, I mean, as it goes. Okay, continuing onward, the two of them continue to have this conversation and compare normal boats to airboats, and it's kind of a funny moment. He's like lowlander boats or lowland boats or something like that. It's a funny moment in the fact that they like teach class in this ship is very interesting because it's this sort of highbrow thing to be this pilot of an airship and to be this person that's in the sky. And it's kind of a fun distinction.
How insulting of Marasi to assume that he does deckhand work on a boat.
To refer to a ship like this as a boat is insulting, which I find very funny because so much of science fiction declares something like this a boat. You know, like anything that would fly in the sky is a boat, it's an airship, and so it's treated very much the same. But this is really kind of actually delineating and trying to create separation between the two to say that they wouldn't act and behave the same, which is interesting.
It is, but it still operates like a boat.
I 100% agree. I'm just saying that the book is trying that like Brandon and the society in general has like valued skyships very differently.
Which is super strange because reality, like the way reality works is like planes are more like cars than they are like boats, right? They're more like buses.
Right.
And we can draw parallels there as opposed to all of science fiction, which it makes sense to make the boat parallels in science fiction technology. And you kind of make that parallel with spacefaring things as well. But I don't quite get why that's because I guess because they can go wherever they want. They're not confined to roads.
I assume that's part of why in a similar way where it's like you're free of pre-fixed fabbed trails, right? In the same way that a boat is for the most part. And you can turn on an axis more or less. Like, you can't actually like just stop and pivot, 360 degrees without, depending on the propulsion, whatever, la-di-da. But you've got more freedom of movement in general, which I think is probably why that's compared more closely.
Yeah, it's true.
And they follow, with a massive caveat here, they follow similar laws of physics. However, water is very complicated because of friction, mass, and displacement and everything else. So, like, they follow very similar rules.
Mm-hmm. That's a very good point.
Yeah. Just at different, how would you put it? Like, different degrees of difficulty, I guess. Like, the water is a lot harder than air is.
That's
obviously
an understatement.
Yeah, right. Well, especially because I said harder. Like, yes, it is harder functionally, but like it is also more difficult. Okay, moving on. We get more on a couple of components that we started to talk about in the chapter prior, the deniers of the masks, whom are dangerous, as well as this new metal that explodes when wet. Et metal, as it's called, and that it seems to be a power source. It powers the primer cube / allomantic grenade that we had talked about before. I mentioned this a little bit early, but this was kind of that delineation for me where I wasn't able to really chat about it too specifically last week, but it's like, it seems like there is something different between a metal being used and something being activated that defines it as separate from magic, which is like science. Magic and science are very closely linked in history, so eventually magic becomes science as we appear to think of it. So, eventually it's all going to become technology, it's all going to become other stuff, but for now,
right,
we're still riding that line.
So there are a few, but in our world, in our physics, do you know what metals explode when they are exposed to water?
I don't know the metals that explode. I know some other chemical reactions that aren't water, but yeah.
So sodium is one.
Okay.
And potassium is another.
Oh, potassium I actually did kind of know. Interesting.
So if this is potassium... I was fucking onto something with the banana shit.
Potassium is a fascinating metal in general, but that is funny. I had not considered the sort of danger of getting, I'm assuming powderized potassium, right? Most of the metallic, like the actual
pure potassium.
Oh, pure potassium. Okay, yeah, because a lot of them,
pure sodium will explode when it gets submerged in water as well. But how cool would it be if this is potassium, if that metal is potassium, and bananas actually become tangentially important to the story?
How would they grow bananas in the frigid winter environments, though? Like,
Harmony can change the grow
GMO'd
banana
a banana. Fuck you. All right. They chat about some things that are resolved by the end, but rationalize that there's going to have to be some trading of information and technology here in order to win the governor over on their decision to head to the temple in the end as a group. Everyone kind of rallies in. Wax is like interceding inside of this conversation eventually after they're, having it for a while. And there's going to be compromise to come, and this is kind of setting the groundwork that, like, this is earth-shattering. This is Scadrial breaking again in a very different way than previously.
I don't even know how you'd go about breaching this conversation, let alone doing it like while you're with this new race of people on this new, wildly new technology to your people. Like, how do you just feel open enough to like talk about the the politics of all of it? I would feel very awkward about that. But maybe that's just my personal issues shining through. I don't know.
Can you imagine trying to negotiate for your entire people, like, on a whim? This is to me, my first thought was very similar to, like, Mars Attacks, where it's like suddenly you're put in charge of, like, a population. You're like, I'm not the leader. What? No, I can't. I'm not You can't put me in charge of the of negotiating the alien invasion. And it's very similar, I think, for Alec, who is way out of his depth on this stuff, despite being a very experienced pilot. and a very interesting
We don't know if he's a
around.
very experienced pilot. He's the only pilot we've met.
It's fair. He seems to be an experienced pilot.
He's confident. Maybe he's the shittiest pilot in their entire race.
And it's just like a total false confidence. Oh no. I feel so bad for Alec now. Yeah. So they decide, of course, to go to the temple. We already talked earlier about the dueling problems with like Leslie's, where she actually lands on the spectrum and why she's going there. But they do decide to, and so we move there. We end the chapter with having seen Suit having beaten them to the site, and yeah, it's just
fast motherfucker, dude.
Yeah,
that's some bullshit. Him getting there first, but I suppose he has access to steel pushing, so presumably he's flying there. And
there is that. There are some questions about how everyone gets there, but I think that this is something that the set had planned on going and were already moving towards previously, because he's been off screen the whole time. He hasn't been in this book. We've been like surmising where he is, and we've been kind of following the path, but they've already set out for this expedition.
Textually, they talked about how they'd probably be a couple days ahead because they can go straight, like a straight line there. They
assumed that, but it's not as though they left at the same time to go there, if that makes sense.
Fair. Good point.
Like Suit, as we saw Suit chatting with Kelesina through the radio effectively, there's nothing to say that he wasn't there already or that he wasn't approaching on like a boat or something like that. He wasn't in the city. He wasn't in Dulcing when we got there. So it may have only been a couple of days, but it could have been longer. Like it could have been longer. We just don't know.
Yeah, I thought they talked specifically about Suit's location versus where they were, and he had a lead that they knew about, but they presumed that they would still get there ahead of him.
I think that would be rational if it was only him, but the fact that it's also this whole crew of like people and whatnot, it's unlikely that all of them are, steel pushing allomancers.
Right.
And like, can you imagine deploying a legion of steel pushing like hemalurgists and the amount of steel that you would need to give those people to be able to like fill up their vials and just like keep going and deal with the cold extended? Like,
yeah,
it'd be a lot. But it's not.
They're
untenable.
Not particularly cold. That's the thing.
They're still sensitive to it. Like this is very cold for Wayne and Wax and the other people, but like. It's not nearly as bad as it is for Alec.
Right. Okay. I didn't get that feeling off of it for some reason. Like it felt... Our interactions with the, like, how cold it was always through Alex's perspective.
Wayne talks about it too, though.
But him talking about how cold it was.
Right. But Wayne talks about it too, and I think Brandon does a really good job of saying, like, everyone is passing around heating medallions to keep themselves warm because it is cold, and it's colder up in the air. Like, he describes it as cold up in the air because naturally it would be as you move into the atmosphere and you're flying
And there's
higher.
the hot chocolate.
Yeah. And there's the hot chocolate. But Wayne specifically mentions when they get to the ground that, like, this is snow unlike any that he's ever seen, and that it's, like, it's not just, like, crunchy, or it's not, like, malleable, compact, or like just a crunchy layer. It is like stepping into something that is like dense and sharp and like dangerous almost. Like there's this otherworldly sense with something like snow, which to me reads like, oh, you fucking, like, it's -20 out. Cool. Like this is a bad day, but like it's not the end of the world, But that not everyone has the Minnesotan experience or otherwise. So
that's true.
I read that as like, this is unnatural for them.
Yeah, that's fair.
But that said, like, my rational brain was like, oh, a bunch of pansies, huh? So, with that, we go into chapter 23, and wow, do we have 9 more chapters to talk about. So, I have to ask, when did you figure out that Telson was a bad guy, potentially? For me, I remember this happening, like, combined with everything else, and just went, nuh-uh, couldn't be. Like, it was somewhere in the realm of between this chapter and the next chapter that it, like, really tipped me off. But I remember specifically this moment with Wayne, in which we're in his perspective and she's like hanging out of the side, basically being this flag in the sky. and the way that they kind of like knock the thing out at the end of the chapter being like a big tell for me.
Mm-hmm. We talked about this before. I don't know if that stayed in a little bit. I think for me, I don't remember if it was this chapter or what, but whenever she was talking about having dinner with their uncle, for whatever reason, that stuck out in my mind because it didn't feel like the kind of prisoner relationship she was presenting it to be.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the most specific like point that I could direct you to, but it was, I think, more gradual than a single point.
Yeah, I do agree with you. I think that it was gradual, but I think this was the point where I became skeptical, if that makes sense, because I think up until this point, you can believe Telsin for the most part on her word as someone who has been a prisoner and everything else, and like her actions make sense logically. I think Telsin is incredibly well written, by the way. Easily, the deception still hit me when she shoots Wax in the end.
Same.
Because you don't expect that, even because like that is a breaching of moral grounds that like Wax wouldn't do to his sister, like in theory, until he's shot upon, then he shoots. But you know,
yeah, it feels, even though I felt like she was being deceptive and was maybe on Edward's side, I didn't think that she was strictly against Wax,
like a murderer. Like you wouldn't do that. But then we remember that like Suit has been very clear that he's been actively working against the Set to keep Wax alive. And like we may have thought that was a lie before, but I think if nothing else, this solidifies that like Edward more or less believed that Wax had a place at the table and that he shouldn't be killed because he's family, versus Telsin is just cold-blooded, get the job done, fuck you, dude.
Yeah.
Energy.
Fuck you, dude energy.
Well, because it's better for society. She's in the end, her net goal is to benefit society. So,
right.
And the people that she can put in power, specifically. Anyway, we're in Wayne's perspective, and there's a lot of wonderful things said here. I'll say this. This feels like the first time in a long time that in a long while that we've been in his perspective and he's just being himself. And I love it. Man, it's just wonderful to have this dose of seeming honesty from this character from a perspective that is otherwise clouded in other perspectives and judgments and the way that he evaluates the world based on someone else's mind. This is something that I've been missing from Wayne for a while. And I think that's intentional on Brandon's part. I think he's been, like you had said before, he's been clouding himself and personalities and alcohol and trying to drown out who he is. So
and on top of that, there's been a lot of shit going on, man.
Like,
it's hard to fault him for that. It's been a busy couple weeks. So, yeah. But yeah, I agree with you. It's really nice to see him being himself here.
Yeah. Yeah, it's good to hear his voice, but like his actual internal monologue, as opposed to him trying to get something done, which is often the way that his voice has been over the last book and a half or so. But the ship takes a lurch and they go into land. Marcy has a wonderful line after Alex says that it's not that difficult to land. She replies, well, technically it's not. It's probably the easiest thing to do with a flying ship, assuming you're not picky. And this is just a great way of saying that like crashing is landing too, if you think about it. It feels like something plucked out of a James Bond film that someone would repeat to Bond while like staring. You know, like it feels very... It feels good. I like this line, but it feels like pulled from a Bond movie to some degree.
It does. Of everybody in this book, I don't understand how Marcy is the one that delivers a line that makes me double over. But like I absolutely lost it when I heard this or read this line the first time.
This is like a shockingly funny joke. There are a couple of those that happen over the course of this week, but this was one I agree with you that like absolutely was like this is too good. Like, this is a perfect bit in the middle of an otherwise, like, this feels like something that Wax should be saying in the moment, and it's just better that it's Marasi in every way.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So, yeah. After the landing, they approach the fortress and notice a massive statue of the Sovereign with one spiked eye and carrying the spear that supposedly killed the survivor. This is really interesting because obviously we have other reveals later, but at this moment, thinking about these two things, what did you make this out to be, the statue and everything here? We talked a little bit about this earlier, but what'd you think of this kind of presentation, this fortress, this entire idea of this temple built by it's supposed to be the Lord Ruler, so a god.
Yeah, in thinking about it more, there's one eye spike, and that was never a part of the Lord Ruler's depiction. So that's something different, but potentially still accurate if he were to come back alive in some way. I saw all of this as more relic than actual meaningful artifact. Or maybe those words are flip-flopped, whatever. Like, I saw it more as symbolism than anything. Like, I didn't really have any consideration that the spearhead would be anything other than decorative. But at the same time, I was curious with the fact that they're not the first ones here in millennia. Like, there are clearly other people here. We know Suit got here first, and Wayne understands the value of just aluminum. Mm-hmm. How has this not already been pilfered? Was something that stuck out in my mind as well. Like, why is this still here? Why hasn't it been desecrated long before now? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, Suit hadn't made it up the mountainside necessarily yet, so they hadn't beaten them to the fortress. They'd beaten them to the area in general, and so that's why they decided to pull the emergency landing to beat them by a little bit. But the people that came before with the airship were there clearly to destroy the bands, and so they were, or get the bands, destroy it with the bombs, and so they wanted to take out the temple and everything else. And they weren't out to be thieves so much as they were out to make sure that that no one could return to take this power, or that otherwise it couldn't be a temptation. I think the bands feel representative to me of a nuke in a way. Like, it feels like we've entered almost a mad, mutually assured destruction era, but with one side having access with nuclear proliferation and the others not quite developing it yet, as I consider this. But
yeah, that's fair.
So I think that's why. I think that there haven't been a whole lot of people here, but many have failed. And I think it's because a lot of them, likely as well, of the Southerners as we know them, they aren't there are very few allomancers, so they can't detect whether or not the metal is useful or not. You know, they can't use that side of allomancy, so they don't really know. Yeah, like, did they just pick all of the metal in hopes that it's worth something?
That's a good point. Yeah, I don't have a response to that.
It's meant to be innocuous, which I think is genius on the part of the Sovereign of making, these two things.
But Wayne recognized it too.
I mean, he recognizes the metal. He doesn't recognize that it is... Wayne does not recognize that it is composed of many metals or anything like that.
But he recognizes that it's a valuable metal.
Yeah, because he thinks he can make money on it.
Aluminum. Exactly. I mean, that's kind of where I'm coming from.
Sure.
Is that, if it was that easy to just take, why hadn't it been taken already?
This raises a question about the Southerners then. Is aluminum valuable? Is it readily available? Is it something that's not useful because there aren't that many allomancers? Aluminum doesn't have a whole lot of use outside of fabricating things relatively easily, because that's where aluminum's actual use lies. But it doesn't have a whole lot of use allomantically if you don't have a ton of allomancers.
Yeah, that's a good point.
What are you hiding things from people? So... Mm-hmm. It's interesting. But like we said, Wayne snags the spearhead, thinking about the little engineer that he has to continue to help fund, and catches back up with the rest of the crew. We get confirmation when we get into the temple that this was, in fact, where R'hllor had found himself. And wow, does it get more interesting from here as we find ourselves in something that is so reminiscent of an Indiana Jones film that I can't help but bring it up here for the gajillionth fucking time over the course of this book. And there are many, many traps and many of the old hunters slain here as a result that we had said had been seeking this out. It seems to predominantly be 2 groups-ish, roughly, an initial set of hunters and then the people that were coming to bomb out the temple, it appears. So it's not as though there's bodies and bodies and bodies piled everywhere, but there's enough for this to feel like a ruin that was sought after a little bit, found but never returned from before.
Yeah, fucking Indiana Jones superfan here, just casually dropping that shit again.
Every time. You can't stop me. No one can stop me.
I do love that this prompts Milan to become basically like a silent minesweeper going forward. These traps are fucked, dude.
Mm-hmm. They are messy, and it does basically turn into like a serious... It's using Milan for what the Conjurer are good for to some degree, which is, I mean, like, you can, if you have an immortal being, have them set off the traps, of course. Like, that's the natural, like, an immune mortal being, fine. Like, this is but a scratch for now for them, so...
Not really, though.
I get why.
That's the thing.
We know that it's more than that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And she does say that she can shut her nerves off, or that she's able to. So there's that component to it. But still, it even then, this still weakens Milan. Like, it's not as though she can heal immediately. Like, she's limping later on.
Yeah,
so
I mean, because her bones can't heal.
Mm-hmm.
And the bones are what gives structure. And she's breaking the shit out of them.
Right. Naturally.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do want to bring up, just as a small side note here, I don't know how you felt about him, but the lewd comments from Wayne and Alec are like a bit objectifying. From Wayne, it's fine because it's you assume that that's a part of the relationship. For Alec, it's a little weird, and it feels a little, kind of 1-2 punchy. I don't know. How'd you feel about it?
It's all weird. Like, yeah. Wayne, at least we get history.
Mm-hmm.
And understanding. That's still weird.
Yeah.
Alec
it's
is
got
out
a bit
of nowhere.
Of ick, Yeah.
And Alex is... I could be convinced that his is out of curiosity more than lewdness. Because he doesn't say anything explicitly like lewd. It's more just
the
encouraging to continue.
Yeah.
And I think he's very curious about Milan's physiology. Or I could see that being an explanation of why this is happening.
Yeah, for sure. I just love that phrasing. It sounded like a Brandon phrasing of something that was like sexual, like curious about their physiology. Like, you can imagine. I'm not putting it on you, but like it's very, very
given
funny.
the fact that he's looking at an immortal that clearly has different physiology. Like, I could be okay with that rationalization, the way that this is all written out. I don't know if I
definitely
buy it,
agree,
but
yeah, I think that I definitely agree. I think that I agree with you on both fronts. Like, I don't necessarily buy it, but I can try to push it in a different direction. For Wayne, okay, like they're a thing, they're dating, they're an item, but maybe not a perpetual item. Who knows? Well, they're definitely not a perpetual item because
she's a perpetual item.
She's a perpetual item. She's on the market forever, baby. So yeah. Anyway, I just wanted to I feel like I have to bring that up because it's yep. That's it. We're gonna leave that there. I love after Milan begins to set off all of these traps that Wayne brings up another of the old moves that they used to pull to close out this chapter. It's just such a funny note.
What move was it? It wasn't spoiled tomato.
No, it was like Blackfoot something. Not Blackfoot.
Oh, it was the one that he made up on the spot.
Was it?
That was the same as spoiled tomato, right?
I don't think it was. I'll double check real quick because I think it's worth it. Chapter 24, and then back a page. Black Watch Double Stomp.
Yeah, that's the same as spoiled tomato, I think. And he made it up to like trick Wax into doing it when they were on the roof.
He did. So it would be the same move. It would be the same move. You're 100% correct. Mm-hmm. Yep. Good call. Yeah.
Funny shit,
though. I think that makes it better because it's like, oh, I thought I was good at this. She's way better at this. The same move. She'd be way better at the spoiled tomato, of course. Naturally.
Mm-hmm.
It's a fun little bit. All right. So we go into chapter 24, and there is a lot of sort of various components here that go into the breakdown and thinking about harmony and sort of the bands and Steris and not Steris, but the Lord Ruler, and comparing like the sort of balance in the Historica. Like, did the Lord Ruler make the right call of saving people despite violence? We have the history of Atium, which is a lost metal, of course, that has disappeared off of the planet. There's just so much here that is sort of like core history that we've already touched on as we find the little spike belonging to R'hllor. Did you have any thoughts immediately on the way that this chapter opens and Marasi's perspective, evaluating the sort of mythic story that she finds herself in?
I mean, it sort of is a stand-in for the philosophical question that we're presented with towards the end of Era 1 of like,
mm-hmm.
How do we evaluate the Lord Ruler's actions or inaction or the path that he followed? And what is morality? Is it more noble that he was aiming for a better world at the expense of the immediate people around him, or would it have been more noble to save the people around him at the expense of the world at large? Like, it's almost impossible to have an answer to that clean-cutly.
Yeah. I think that it gets really interesting, too, when you consider the fact that we think about Trell at the end of this and sort of the red that's looming over the world. And you think about the chance that Trell had maybe been kept away for a long time because of the Lord Ruler, potentially, and sort of the way that society was going. And maybe there's something else there. Like, there's another rationale. Trell, as for the record, is a very interesting nomenclature considering the powers that we know. The names directly relate to the power of said god. So Trell seems like a stand-in name for something that we do not fully understand yet.
For sure.
Yeah. But especially I think that it's important to evaluate this because I think Trell didn't maybe perhaps intercede before because everything was going okay to them, just like it kind of was for preservation. Like the world was fine, and now it's different, as we kind of come to realize by the end of this week. But there's so much fun stuff to talk about here inside of this context. I have to pee real badly, so we're going to do that real quick. Quick 2-3 minute break. All right, cool. Ready?
Yep.
So we go to Steris here and this sort of useless equation that she discusses. She's built out this sort of usefulness calculation to the party, and it's a very interesting moment that happens between her and Marasi here. And Marasi takes it in a very different direction, I think, than Steris had intended. There's lots of contemplation here about who they both want to be. And Steris reveals that she loves wax. I mean, there's this fantastic moment that Marasi kind of pulls out of her with a fishing rod as she starts to dig in. And it's great because Marasi was previously the interested party, or the other interested party, and you can very clearly see, if it wasn't very clear beforehand, that, you know, she can remove herself enough from this equation, and has removed herself enough from this equation to love that for her sister, to now see her sister in love with someone that she had looked up to as a myth and everything else. It's something that she can appreciate, as well as feel this sort of strong, genuine feeling of like she felt like she knew her sister, and this is a shocking character moment reveal for her. You know, it's defying expectations in a big way. And that just feels excellent, I think, especially from characters interacting and feeling that.
It does, but at the same time, I feel like we haven't actually had much interaction between these two one-on-one at all. Like, this feels like one of the first actual meaningful interactions between the two. And at the very least, without Wax as an intermediary.
Mm-hmm.
Or Wayne, for that matter.
Yeah, I can get behind that, especially since the beginning. I mean, like, thinking back, like you're saying, Alloy of Law is maybe the last time that I remember when they were first introduced, and like the two of them were side by side. We didn't know that they were siblings yet necessarily, but they were, Wax is still there in the scene, but
it's also in Wax's perspective.
Like, yeah, I know. I'm just trying to think of the last time that this happened to any degree.
That's not like an emotionally meaningful interaction between the two of them. It's just two of them both there interacting with Wax.
Yes, yeah, you're right. For sure.
I don't mean to nitpick, but it feels strange that we haven't had more sisterly sort of interaction.
I think it's because there's that divide between them to some degree, or it feels like there's that divide, right? I think this is where Marasi says that it's impossible to hate Steris. Like, you can dislike the way that she does things, you can dislike all of these different things, you can think that she's neurotic for the way that she tackles things, but you cannot hate her despite everything, which I think is wonderful.
I agree, but just to make a counterpoint to that, does that distance does that separation only exist because of distance? Like, they're not regularly interacting with each other. So does that lack of interaction feed the separation?
The separation in the
are we perceiving more of a difference between them, or are we perceiving more distance between them because we just don't get any actual interaction as opposed to getting negative interaction?
I'm not suggesting that there isn't any interaction or that there's negative. Like, I'm on a different equation than what you're saying. I understand what you're saying, so I'll respond to what you're suggesting. I think that it is the negative on the equation side. So it's because that we assume that there's no issue, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Or that there are no problems. Not because we get more and then it would yield a beneficial relationship or like a beneficial additive to the story. Because they probably do have small, quiet moments. They probably do share things, but this story is not one that focuses on the small, quiet moments between people almost ever, with a couple of exceptions. That's
a good point.
Well, I mean, like, really, the only ones that, that I can think of for the most part are like our hero villain moments, and then Steris and Wax, and the one moment with Wayne and his sort of solemnity, or I guess kind of two moments with Wayne, solemnity towards the daughter that he wronged, and then the moment with Renette, kind of.
Kind of.
Yeah. Big caveat there. But for the most part, the story doesn't deal in that. So I like to believe that it's the negative space, like you were suggesting, that yields this. But I do want to just say that I don't think that impacts the way that she feels about, like, you can't be mad at her despite these things. I feel like that's just knowing someone deeply and intimately.
Yeah.
Like, that just comes from being a sibling.
That's true.
Yeah. And then Wayne comes in and doesn't exactly spoil the moment, but does ground Marasi again versus her previous earth-shattering moment here with Steris. To follow that up, there's a moment of parley before we head over to Milan, Alec, and Wax continuing to take down traps, and Wax begins to work out the pattern of the traps, which is just kind of an excellent detective moment. Again, we channel our Indiana Jones. We've switched from Sherlock Holmes to Indiana Jones. And after they make it through them, they arrive at some writing that Alec doesn't quite understand, which is interesting here.
Mm-hmm. Is this the same writing that interacts with later, or is this different writing?
It's the same writing, because they come back to the same room.
They come back to the same thing, and they make a note of the fact that Alec doesn't understand it there as well.
Right.
Like, there's something so... I know I should know. Like, it feels like I should know this, and it feels like I should be able to have picked this up through context clues, but I really am struggling.
Well, this gets to a question, especially with Alec having the medallion that understands languages, but it equates to the identity of the people that you're talking with, or the area. Has the area changed? And so maybe that's why, or is the language incongruous with the area, so he cannot read and understand it? Like, how... There are questions there, which I think are great. We don't get answers to, but that's the closest that we can get to an assumption.
Well, we don't know anything about written language versus spoken language either.
Fair point. Fair enough.
So That, I mean, I would assume it would probably... I am equating this thing to a Babelfish like we talked about last week, but I know there are differences.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know what to make of it. It feels... Branderson does a great job of this feeling in general of the story is so dense and there are so many secrets and so many intricate parts that this is still a satisfying story, even though I feel like there's something here that I should get, but there's just a key piece missing.
Well, it's like if it were high speech, if it were like, Spook's language, we would be able to read it and understand it from Maricy's perspective. And we would assume that probably Wax would know enough or Wayne would know enough to be serviceable. Actually, Wayne does know enough to be serviceable. We know that from Alloy or Shadows of Self. So like we know that some of the characters would know that. So it seems like it is a completely different language. Could it be like the old language that was spoken back in, Luthadel back in the day?
Potentially.
It's a question posed.
Is this a different language now than what Vin spoke? I would assume not.
Would assume not as well. Yeah.
Because Spook wrote the book that was
Spook wrote
given to Wax.
The Hemalurgy book, yes. Yeah, right.
So presumably that is a shared language.
Yeah, right. And like the words of founding could have been translated, but, like regardless, I think that we can stand by the idea that it seems as though at the very least it's a preserved language. Like the old language is preserved, so we know what it would read as. People would know that this would be that language, but this seems removed.
This seems
from
different
that entirely. Yep.
Maybe it's an old Terrace language.
Maybe it's meant to be something that is a red herring.
Yeah. Pointing to it twice.
Mm-hmm. Could be. I mean, like it genuinely, like, there are some things. I mean, why not?
Where's the information coming from that this is something that the Lord Ruler would have understood? That feels so out of place and extra.
It comes down to the idea that the Sovereign is the Lord Ruler who built this temple, so it is something that he would understand. Okay. Because he is the only one who could access this inner chamber because everyone else died a la Karnak.
Okay, so it comes down to that same assumption. Gotcha.
I think so. I think it's all derivative of the same idea for the most part.
Okay.
Yeah. There's this strong moment with Telson here where she asks Wax a serious question about how she got where she is, and with context at the end, it's made even stronger that these two have struggled on their own as children for a long time without their parents, and their split views on their possibilities that the bands have for society becomes ever more evident as this conversation, not only the first time, but especially on a reread, this gains so much context as to how they are philosophically very different people.
Yeah, I really appreciate that sort of similar upbringing and diverging paths. You see it obviously pretty frequently in fiction. Mustang and the Jackal, similar sort of idea. But it does feel good in this moment to have this interaction, and the retrospective kind of ripping away of the importance of it is just heartbreaking.
Mm-hmm. It really is. It's something that is tough to square up against in the moment because, I mean, you really don't know. Like, you understand that these are fundamentally different people, and we've known that since the prologue. Like, they behave very differently. They have very different modus operandi, and they reacted to the loss of their parents very polar ways.
Did have a different upbringing, though, in that Telson was in the Terrace village for a lot longer than Wax was.
Yeah, and Wax was presumably with Edwarn for a long time. Yeah. So makes him more of the father figure, which, yeah. Mm-hmm. So we end the chapter on two curious notes. One where the traps are brought into question as to why they're there to begin with, and a second with Edwarn having given himself up to the clutches of Wax and Wayne to begin with. This would be a point that I would consider ending the week on, because it is the reveal that Edwarn is giving himself up. Maybe the next chapter, with the bracers being gone. But given the idea, what do you think of this week? Or not this week, excuse me, Jesus. What do you think of this moment where Edwarn gives himself up and what we find with the traps and the intentionality there?
The point with the traps and the contemplation of like, why would they do this in the first place was really, really a smart contemplation to have. I kind of had that idea too. Not to the same extent. But to the extent of like, now why is this so complicated? Because it does feel like Indiana Jones. It does feel so like comically complicated and comically booby-trapped. Mm-hmm. But it didn't quite get to the same point of, because it's all a decoy in my head. But as far as Edwarn giving himself up, that gave me oh fuck vibes. Like, that in no way made sense to me on a, like, legitimate level.
Yeah.
Like, there was no scenario where it made sense for me for Edwarn to just signal himself as parlaying.
Sure.
And he knows they have access to the radio or whatever. Like, there are so many different ways he could interact with them if he wanted to, but he wanted to be there. Mm-hmm. And there's not a benign reason for that in my head.
Yeah, there can't be a benign reason. Like, Edwarn is so particular and he's so well planned and thought out that if you didn't have the red flag beforehand, your red flag is flagging and you're inspecting everyone around trying to figure out how he's going to make this work. Yeah, I definitely agree with you there.
Imagine if Marasi had just shot him dead.
Well, she wouldn't have shot him dead because he was probably burning steel, or he could have burned steel to block the bullet or push the bullet away. You know, like, if he's not already.
Yeah, that's fair.
But you're right. I wish Marasi would have, just to out him right away. That would have been better. Could have had this fight in the snow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true.
All right, with that, Chapter 25. Wax allows Edwarn to join the group as they adventure deeper into the temple and lets us know that the set did, in fact, torture as many of Alec's people as it appeared, and also has that same sort of smugness around the utility of these things as we'd expect, and sort of the way that he thinks about people, and it's kind of just... We knew that he was despicable, but to, like, kind of get it so literally makes it, like, gross taste in mouth, especially compared to, sort of regular characters. You can justify an evil character and make someone feel good about it because of their justifications, but Edwarn is so philosophically linked and not like directly people linked that it just feels disgusting because it's a monologue, not like a, I had to do this, otherwise X was going to happen. Like, there's some immediacy that you can get away with having a character do evil things, but this is less immediate and more grandiose, and so it feels evil-er. But Edwarn has come to negotiate, despite having given himself up. Overall, it's a very tense moment. You can sense nearly everyone's desire to shoot the man in this moment, but he has the key to offer to the temple and those secret words we mentioned before.
In general, this whole section felt like some of the most rushed that we've experienced from Branderson.
Okay.
Like, I talked about it at the beginning of this episode, like his thing, the Branderlanch or whatever it's called. Mm-hmm. Sanderlanch.
Yeah.
I just imposed our
We
own
call him Branderson.
Sort of.
Most people call him Sanderson. So Sanderlanch. For us, Branderlanch makes sense. So I understand.
Yeah, like, that's his thing. I get it. Mm-hmm. But this felt lacking in details in order for that part, like that acceleration, to be satisfying for me. Like, it just felt like we were missing things, and it just felt brushed through.
Interesting. Yeah, I think I agree with you by and large. It does feel a little fast, and it also, actually, to me, it almost feels unnecessary. Like, we're interrogating this guy who wants to come along, and we have him at gunpoint. We don't necessarily need his rationalizations as much. Like we do, I think that we got too much rationale. I think on the other side of this, like we got so much rationale that it felt like we needed more, but I think Brandon could have gotten away with less to make it feel more approachable, if that makes sense. Like, sure, we'll take him hostage. We don't need the sort of mutually assured destruction argument here.
Give some sort of external understanding that he knows the secret to get in.
Yeah, that's it.
And then this makes sense.
Yeah.
But like, what's his motivation for any of this? It feels hollow and forced.
Yeah. Which is why I think that like less is more here to some degree. Like if you step this back a little bit, it becomes more of a scene where it's like, just say that he is the key. We don't need any other explanation.
Or
Marcy can keep him on gunpoint.
Extend this by like 30 pages and get an interrogation scene and get like more in-depth conversation between Wax and Edwarn. And I don't think the less is more
awkward middle ground
works here. Like I think you need more here.
I think almost nothing could work here fairly well. I have the key, you need me, is enough of a motivation. We don't need the sort of, well, you can't make it out alive without me. Like, they're going to shoot you if you leave. It's obvious. They have guns pointing at us. They're going to shoot us if we try to take off. Like, there's so much definition here that you actually lose some of the tension if it weren't for Marcy being stressed out in the scene and like pointing the gun. Like the tension in the scene is maintained because of Marcy, and that's the only, for me, it's the only emotional connection that I have to this moment, or like for the most part, because like you said, either you go more and you make Wax tortured out of him or a character tortured out of him, or I think you can go less and just get away with the bare minimum of like, we're going to keep you at gunpoint. You have the key. Take us to the place. Like, yeah, either works.
Either way.
Yeah.
Something else.
This is a weird middle ground where it doesn't perfectly land, but of course, this proves to be entirely true. He does have the key to this incredibly complex allomantic lock that could have otherwise kept them out for another 10 years if they would have made an error. He says that it spells out something the Lord Ruler would have understood. Do you have any ideas as to what it would be? We, of course, explored the like, what the fuck could this be?
There's a triangle. Like, there's a couple descriptions of the things that he's pushing on.
Mm-hmm.
But a triangle could be a mountain, but that has nothing to do with the Lord Ruler. I mean, it does, but not the Lord Ruler specifically, you know? Like, I have no idea, and I'm sure the clues are there, is kind of where I'm at on this right now.
Yeah, I think that the puzzle was kind of pointing towards where the power is in different times. So, like, the triangle is meant to represent the mountain and where the Well of Ascensions are. I think there's an inverted triangle, which to me points to the Pits of Hathsin. And then I think it's, like, pushing them together as one, which is harmony. Kind of roughly, vaguely, but this, again, is without some of the immediate specifics. But those were my vague ideas. I do want to posit by the end of this week that I think that the words in the wall just repeat and say the same thing, and it's just survive, 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 survive.
So
survive.
I mean, that would point to Kelsier being this sovereign.
Yeah, which I think the text is doing, but
I think so.
We're
too.
almost there. We're almost there where we can talk about it.
It's pointing in a couple different directions.
Well, I think it's intentionally misleading us, which Kelsier would do, which is the thing, right? Like, Kelsier would create something that some people would believe is one thing and would be ominous about his identity so as to keep it a mystery.
Yeah, that's fair.
But Kelsier's alive to begin with? Like, that's a whole thing to unpack. How'd he live?
I don't know yet.
Yeah. Right? They say he survives, that he survived even in the religion.
Mm-hmm.
But how? He's been dead for fucking 5 books now.
But we have a pretty immaculate return to life here in this book in the form of wax. Like,
yeah,
who's to say that couldn't happen as well?
That's true. But yes. After Milan clears that trap of rooms, everyone but Edward and Wax stay behind as they continue around to check it out. Wax and Edward share fun conversation about the basis of law and how it can be changed to and for those that are in power and to suit your needs. But man, it's a wonderful little bit where he really exposes quite a bit more about the intention of the set's actions, and we start to get some semblance of a direction for this otherwise nameless and formless organization that we really haven't had a deeper understanding of outside of it's some wealthy people that are mad.
Yep. All of these characters are so complex and complete, and being in these like perspectives and interacting so closely with them is very, very satisfying for me. It's nice to see this all play out so realistically in my head. What I really like about this section is how much it parrots the flashback that Wax had from when he was a kid dealing with Edward at the bank. Like, they haven't changed. Like, they're dealing with different things, but their perspectives are very much in line with where they were before.
Mm-hmm. I think that's by and large correct, because I don't think that Wax has shifted any of his beliefs necessarily throughout this. Wax is in a lot of ways moralistically an unchanged character, or an unchanging character. He changes fundamentally in some emotional ways, but otherwise he holds his moralistic high ground throughout this entire series, which is very interesting, very atypical, I think. Even when Zoot and other characters try to interrogate it. What? What'd you say?
Maybe that changes in the next book.
I think it is the possibility to some degree. I think, or maybe often when you have a character who doesn't change despite a lot of circumstances, their story is a tragedy, right? And that's the other side of sort of the Greek story coin, is the fact that he couldn't adapt to change, or that he couldn't think or see change. He fails in his own way. That can be death. That can be, any number of other ways. So we've yet to see that play out, but it is, to me at the very least, I think that it is a fundamental question. And I think it's part of the reason that some people don't like this series, is because Wax kind of feels static. Or not the series, but that they don't like Wax is because he kind of feels static. And to some degree, he does have that sort of static nature to him. Mm-hmm. But how do you write a paladin otherwise? Like, paladins have to be fucking paladins. They can question their faith, and that should be a part of the quest, I guess. But we haven't seen...
We have seen that, though.
We've seen his literal questioning of his literal faith, but not his questioning of the morality.
Of Harmony the Impotent.
Omnipotent or impotent?
Impotent.
Okay.
He calls him Harmony the Impotent.
Yes, yeah, you're right. But that's him literally questioning his faith in a direct way, which is a thing for paladins, but generally questioning your faith also impacts your actual morals as you evaluate people and society, and we never saw that cascade, if that makes sense. Like, a paladin who falls off of the path, or a cleric, or like anyone in the sort of religious pantheon of fantasy characters, when you start to question something, it cascades into other questions in your life. Mm-hmm. And this never breached the gap of religion, if that makes sense. That's really my issue with it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, he questions his faith, sure, but he questions it just as a faith, not as the ideology. And here's the caveat answer that I can already predict that I'll get in an email or a tweet or something, is that the faith of the path is one in which it demands very little of you. So to lose faith in it to begin with isn't necessarily that big of a deal, because it doesn't really have a strict morality, like a strict basis of, fine. And my answer there is fine. That makes for a very uninteresting paladin, is kind of the core point there.
Right.
So,
fair point.
All right. This proves to be entirely true, of course. They finally find where the bracers are supposed to be located, on top of this sort of velvet pretty throne that's clearly been dressed up for, you know, something like a museum in some ways. And it's smashed and they're gone. They're lost. They've been stolen. Oh no.
Oh no.
Oh no.
What are we ever going to do?
Oh no. What will we do?
Uh-oh.
Oh no. Uh-oh. Okay, cool. With that, we go on to chapter 26. That's what we're going to fucking do. And the room itself appears to be empty, as we had mentioned. It's an interesting moment where genuinely everyone seems incredibly surprised, including Suit and Telson, at the bands being missing. And with that, Suit calls for an end to this charade as they've marched and paraded all these people into the room. Telson pulls an aluminum gun out and shoots Waxilium, while his bullet intended for her that he quick draws and shoots at her is pushed away by someone else's allomancy.
God damn it, does that suck, huh?
It's painful, man. This is one of those that, like, it stings.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
Even seeing it coming, it still sucks.
Yeah. It's, you want better for everyone involved, and you would wish that you want like, truly, I mean, like, you want Telson to actually have this sort of redemption path potentially. However, I think it actually makes her potentially a better villain that she doesn't get one, because I'm afraid of that in the next book to some degree. Internally, this is my own monster talking, but like, if Telson gets forgiven for her awful actions of abducting women and killing people for hemalurgy and everything else that feels bad because she hasn't done anything good, and I can't imagine a single act maybe earning that redemption. But people are always capable of redemption. I'm just talking about the possibility of it here. Anyway.
No, I don't think so.
It is such a shocking moment. If
they do gain redemption, I don't want to fucking have it.
Oh, are you Brandon now? Are you doing your best Brandon interpretation? Good work. No, redemption is something that has to be earned by a character, and you can make it feel very cheap by doing it too quickly, so I understand why. That said, Telson pulling this out here seems like it is doubling down on that character and confirms her as the sequence. It confirms her as this extra sort of evil entity pulling strings in the background, and one with Suit, and that's brutal for our boys, and Marisi and Saris, and Milan.
Yeah.
Our folks, as it were.
And that she's referred to as Lady Sequence, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm still trying to figure out all the meaning behind the terminology.
I think you shouldn't spend too much time on the meaning. If we think about it, the words that we have so far are Suit, Series, Sequence, Set. I mean, it seems to be maybe card related, maybe adjacent to like cards. Maybe. I'll say it again.
And S's.
Maybe. Yeah, and all S's. One more time for emphasis. Maybe. So we moved to...
I still want to know.
Yeah, it's fair. We move to Marisi, who has to think quick. She quickly prepares, lines up her rifle, and takes shots at Suit, and whacks a shot a second time as our reveals pour in. Edwarn is an allomancer, of course, I'm going to caveat here immediately, is later revealed to be a hemalurgist, and Telson is in the set and also an allomancer. Hemalurgist, it seems. We don't get as much confirmation for her as we do for Edwarn, but it seems as though, given what we know, she probably wasn't hiding these abilities and seems to have some spikes poking out later that we reference. But this battle quickly turns in a terrible way as they are unable to handle the pair of Telson and Suit, and Wayne's run off entirely. He's disappeared in this moment of combat, fucked off while they have to deal with it.
Mm-hmm. First pass at this book. Alloy of Law, I think it was. I had made the assertion that Edwarn was secretly a hemalurgist as well, and I felt so smugly like happy about getting that reveal, even though it gets pulled out from under me later on.
Allomancer?
Did I say? I thought
you said hemalurgist. Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Meant allomancer.
Yep. All good. But you're right.
Yeah.
I knew what you meant.
We obviously hemalurgy is a big part of it, but are we to assume that this is strictly like this has nothing to do with the coins? Or could we extrapolate an idea that the coins themselves could also be granting allomancy?
This is clearly hemalurgy. None of the coins are doing anything here.
Okay. Fair.
There is no circumstance in which we can point to allomancy being pulled from anything but the Bands of Mourning so far.
Okay.
And the bands seem exceptional in that way, which exceptionality as an object is temporary as science and technology advance. So, like, the question is, when does the wheel become popularized? When does everyone have a nuke in their car? When are the Bands of Mourning common?
Yeah. I mean, when does everybody have a nuke in their car is a time in the timeline that I want to jump to, frankly.
Honestly, nuke in their car, I'm assuming you're going with nuclear fusion, fission, rather. You actually want a nuke in everyone's car? That's crazy. You trust people far too much.
No, I don't.
That doesn't make it better with nukes.
It
like,
makes
what do
it
you
worse.
mean?
Absolutely.
It makes it way worse.
I want to be there.
A lack of... No, you don't. You fundamentally do not want to be there, actually.
You can't tell me what I want.
Well, okay. All right. Fine. You enjoyed that. I'm going to live in my alternate timeline where we all agreed to not do anything negative with there. Nuclear energy. I made the choice right now.
All right, fine.
You can't tell me what to do. In the same way that I can't tell you what to do. Okay.
As it
shocking
should be.
Moment. As it... Sure. And Wax is bleeding to death at the bottom of this pit. Milan has been injected with the dissolving liquid that we've seen previously used and then has her spike stolen, so she reverts to a mist wraith, leaving her crystal bones behind staring at the ceiling. And our heroes, at the end of this chapter, are in a very, very bad spot.
This is pretty bleak, man.
Yeah.
This is pretty fucked. Why are the crystal bones left behind when she becomes a mist wraith? Because we know mist wraith have bones integrated into them.
Yeah, so I think it's the muscles and everything that are holding on to them, if that makes sense. Like, it's muscle confusion. So I would assume that eventually the Milan mist wraith pile would collect the bones, but wouldn't necessarily assemble them into any format. The bones from mist wraith's previous...
Well, they're also not actually
understood.
Bones.
Yeah, there's that. There's no flesh attached to them, which is kind of our context for mist wraiths and their assortment of bones is that they would eat things and then they would just acquire the bones and they'd be kind of like randomly strewn and like poking out. Yeah. So,
but yeah, and these are inorganic crystal carved into the shape of bones. So maybe the mist wraith wouldn't recognize them.
So it's like, why wouldn't a mist wraith on the field of battle just pick up every sword and become a Pokeball of Doom? You know,
it should. That's a great idea. That's a really like.
Well, mist wraiths don't have brains or don't have sentience to that level.
They do have brains.
They can eat brains. They consume them and then they're gone. They do not gain any intelligence from said brains.
Yeah.
Any other week, this would have been an ending location. Any other week.
God, there's so many good ending locations in this section because I think the next section is also a good ending location.
It really could be. Chapter. So you can get into my brain for how I would usually do these things, and you can very clearly see I would have ended here if it weren't for the everything else going on. And at the same time, it's like, what was I going to take a week away from? Like, was I going to take a week out of Well of Ascension? No. Was I going to take a week out of Hero of Ages? We were already going pretty fast through Hero. Mistborn? No. Like, there's nowhere that I could shave off a week outside of not busting my wrist, but then that only put us back further. Like, we were already... We're going to finish Secret History this week versus, the current schedule.
Right.
Okay. All right. With that, we go into chapter 27. This is a relatively action-packed chapter. If we think about the way that like the death happens and sort of winds down and we go between these different moments, this is when the Sanderlanche has firmly begun, if you didn't think we were in it already. Wax is dying with his metals in him as he reflects on the prologue and how strong how strong those metals feels, and those feelings from the beginning, they're permeating his life as he's remembering these different highlights and the way it relates to him and the current mystery and the ruse of it all. And he prays in these final moments to harmony as he tries to keep himself alive while reading the room and what's going on. And the dead bodies of the centuries are so reminiscent here in this small, low-ceilinged room. It's so reminiscent of Karnak in that moment in Watchmen, and I think of Alexander the Great in the way that he built his final resting temple. Thomas, please correct me on that. But it's wonderful, compelling stuff, and Wax finds the bands that he assumes are the real bands as he dies, the bracers that are on a separate pedestal here.
All of our heroes that have death scenes in these books, Era 1 and 2, have been so compelling and so complicated and heart-wrenching. And this is no exception, obviously. I was caught off guard by this death in general. I knew we didn't really dwell on it when Telsin shot him, or when we talked about Telsin shooting him, but like I really didn't expect it to happen like this. And I know he doesn't die yet here, but the writing was on the wall. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it was
in a different language. Yeah.
Well, yeah. One that we don't know.
Mm-hmm. Just kidding.
Yeah.
But you're right. This is a shocking moment, I think, in a big regard. Like, I also didn't expect Wax to die here. I mean, you know, he's not quite dead yet, but he's dying, he's draining, and it is a very shocking moment to like consider losing a lead. And we previously, Brandon has pulled no punches with death. Death has been something that has been permanent and nigh irreversible. So, you know, this
kind of. Oh, I guess the exception is Sazed, but he didn't die. He ascended. So, yeah.
Yeah, Sazed never died. He grabbed the two powers. But I mean, he kind of defines it here later. Like, he defines the realms, and we're informed a little bit more by everything else. But it seems as though he can't interact with the physical realm. So, regardless, it is one of those things that as a writer you can only do so often, and I think it actually works really well here with Wax as we continue through the next chapter or two and how that plays out. But we're not quite there yet to the death itself. It's just the shocking moment where he's beginning to lose everything. But Edwarn is stalking him through this low-ceilinged room in this darkness with the blood leaking out on the ground and following the trail around as he can. And had that sort of like quintessential villain revealing monologue moment where generally the two parties would be hunting each other around the room, and they'd be like corners with guns up and they'd be shouting at each other. But instead Wax is limping along, you know, barely breathing. And he gives up that Telsin was actually the one who recruited him, and that the truth of society on the whole, this oligarchical power structure, the way that they want to break that down, and that allomancers should no longer be in power. These people who are randomly imbued with abilities, only those who should have them should use them, and the people that have the capability of using the power to their fullest extent, which is just intense as far as like a thought process goes. Edwarn ends this conversation by stepping on a trap and burying the two of them. Almost.
Yeah. Despite any understanding of Telsin being in the set, it was still surprising that she was the one that recruited him and like outranks him. Like that was a fun reveal in this moment. His understanding of the traps was surprising to me, to know like exactly what trap to set off. Because in my mind, it's all pretty hidden, but I don't know.
Well, the moment is that Wax knows each trap, and Wax has been trying to lead him to a trap, and so he chooses to set it off despite being led, if that makes sense. Yeah. Like he knows that he's being led, and he chooses to do it in that moment.
Presumably because he knows it's not a trap that's going to just kill him. It's going to affect both.
He assumed that it's going to kill Wax. Yeah. And probably, it will definitely kill Wax. He could survive it.
Yeah.
Yeah. We then move to Marasi as The group is stripped of their medallions, including Alec of his that was keeping him warm. Telson also reveals that even if the bands weren't there, the airshift left behind was still a very big win for the group, as they now have... we've been talking about the bands as like a nuclear weapon. This seems like it's very clearly similar. I mean, it's at the very least a WMD that they'd be acquiring in a big way to take over society. So
yeah, I mean, like, can you imagine? Like, take the bands off the table. Like, she's right. Like, this is a huge boon of technology being granted to a terrorist organization. Like, it's insane.
Suddenly airplanes, even if it's basically dirigibles, like, that's still a huge deal. Yeah, it's totally correct. It is astonishing how this would still manage to change the world, even if the bands didn't exist. So it does still keep that tension alive, despite us believing at this point that the bands aren't real. So we go back to Wax, and woof, it's bad for our boy. He is down. He's out. Ed Warren is just talking at him, and specifically about the abilities and limitations of hemalurgy and the control that it grants him. And then, as Wax lays dying, Ed Warren picks up those bands off of their nondescript pedestal and uses them, except they're useless. They don't do anything because they're a pair of bracers that seemingly have no capabilities inside of them. Wayne shows up, saving the Dane, slamming him out of the way. The two of them share a somber moment about living without each other as Wax dies.
This is almost such a satisfying moment, like
it could have been a very satisfying end. This could have been, he could have actually died here and it would have been okay from a,
so that's kind of the complicated emotional response I have to this, in that, like, if it was this clean cut and Wayne saved the day like this, I don't think I would have been satisfied. Like, I don't think I would have liked that story. It would have felt too on rails.
Oh, save the day and not had Wax die, if that makes sense?
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying? I think Wax has to die here in order for it to be satisfactory.
Right.
It has to, yeah.
But the fact that Wayne gets here and they get that little moment is very nice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's somber and solemn in a big way, and it really... We've talked about, like, Wayne feeling like he's on his comedic pedestal for a lot of this book, and this feels like a return to Chapter 5, Shadows of Self Wayne, where he's, sitting there staring down the death and the people that he wronged. And it feels like that, but his life since that moment, and losing his dearest friend, and, like, he doesn't want to live without Wax around, and that is tragic in a massive way.
Yeah, it is.
Makes me tear up a little bit just thinking about it.
Oh.
Okay, so we go back to Marcy after that and replies that she's been left the spearhead as opposed to the spikes, and that was traded, of course, by Wayne, that motherfucker trading things around without anyone knowing, the sleight of hand, that roguish man. And we get the report from Ed Warren as he exits the temple that Wax is dead. And that the bands are a decoy. They're seemingly a decoy. What's up?
How do you get out?
Well, the collapse wasn't really a full collapse. It didn't. I mean, obviously, like, Wayne got in, no problem.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, but they don't necessarily. I should say that they don't necessarily point to the bands being a decoy, but they do point to them not working. But Marcy realizes that they're a decoy, and so she's internalizing this and being like, well, of course, naturally, all of these things have been decoys and misdirection. So
yeah, there's so many twists and turns in this entire section. Ed Warren points them to be drained. He assumes them to be real, but emptied of power. But yeah, there's nothing is sacred as far as information goes here. Everything is hearsay and subject to change.
Yeah, there's a lot of that's just kind of hanging just right out of reach. And man, I don't know if anything defines this last part of this chapter better than just right out of reach as we end with Wax and his final moments, and he dies as he realized that the bands were right in front of them the whole time, as he comes to realize that it was the spearhead. Not that he, says that immediately, but he's like, oh, the bands are real. They were there. We missed them. And the darkness arrived and Wax died.
This sentence punched me, man. I could have seen this being an end as well, but you're right.
I would have had such a hard time. Yeah.
That would have been tough.
There are good emotional downbeats to end on in things, and this doesn't feel like one necessarily, especially because of the context to come, if that makes sense. It feels, especially in post, we get a chat with God, and we get some crazy shit in chapter 28. We get Wayne's perspective on death, which I think is important. I would have felt weird to not include this with that for context purposes, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Feeling this as a cliffhanger in a TV show could feel really great, but then you might feel cheapened out when you go into the next episode and immediately it's like the afterlife and he wakes up in blackness and then God's there and that could work. I don't know. Mm-hmm. Regardless, we go into chapter 28, and I want to read a quote here. Wax stilled. Wayne let the hand fall limp. He just wanted to sit here, stare at nothing like those fellows in rows nearby, the ones that weren't crushed. Sit and become nothing. And this is just a fucking tragic moment for Wayne, where he deeply feels that the most important person in his life vanish, die, disappear, and it breaks his spirit in this moment. He picks over his friend's body, finds the shotgun, stills his own shake that's been there since the last time that he picked up a gun and had to use it, before he goes to find those that wronged his friend to put them to justice in his own head. And fuck, is that a moment?
Yeah, it is. But the strongest point that I'd like to make about this is how it compares to Wayne reflecting on Lessie or Bleeder's death in the last book. Because Wayne, I don't know if I said that right. Wax reflecting on that. But Wayne feels the desire to react that way, but pushes against it and pushes through it out of necessity, obviously. They're in pretty dire straits right now, but I think it's interesting that both of them have the same gut reaction to a meaningful death.
Yeah, I think it does make sense. It is a deeply tragic moment for both of them, and that parallel between the two as RWs evaluate losing their significant person in their life. I mean, yeah, it's hard not to draw that comparison, especially considering the way that, we don't see it with Wayne pay off entirely on the other side, where Wax breaks down in Steris's arms and melts and cries at the end of the last book. We don't quite have that same level of clarity and satisfaction, but we do get it in I think a different beat that speaks to the way that Wayne has changed and his character has grown since he met Wax, I guess is probably the better way to put that, but not since we started the story, but since his origin with Wax.
Right. Yeah, it's heavy, dude.
Yeah. Death is heavy. Did you know?
Death is heavy.
Were you aware? Yeah.
I wasn't. It feels bad.
Oh, God damn. Yeah, it hurts. We move over to Marcy, and Marcy comes to realize that it's been the spear the whole time that's been the Bands of Mourning. She has this moment of realization as she looks at it, and she sees all of the different metals intricately woven into this that presents the 16 metals. So it's something. It's certainly something, but then we do eventually jump away from that. But what do you think about the reveal in this moment?
So my strongest reaction to this reveal is maybe unsurprisingly, that of mechanics. Mm-hmm. And something that has kind of stuck out to me as not a problem, but an outlying or unresolved rule for this entire section. And that's that of metal mines being more difficult to push when they're full. And getting the extreme of that here did make that whole thing a little bit more satisfying.
That's interesting because, as we had known it before, part of the reason that metal mines were difficult to push on is because the metal was associated with someone. So it was because of identity that it was difficult to interact with someone else's metal mines or something that was
I don't think that was textual, though. I think that was something that was speculated. Because he does talk about how some metal mines are more difficult than others to detect.
So, yes. So what I'm trying to add in here is that there's no identity tied to it. There's just investiture, right? So because they're the Bands of Mourning, they can be used by anyone. So we assume that it lacks identity in the same way that other things do. So it was what I'm trying to get at is, like, previously this attribute was tied to it being someone else's and it being identified as someone else's. This solidifies it instead as the amount of power, or that there is any power stored in something that makes it a ferrochemical metal mine that cannot be pushed upon or detected to the same degree. It separates identity out of the equation. That's kind of the core point there.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's what I was trying to get at, for the record.
Gotcha.
Does that make sense? Okay, yeah. Because I think that it makes sense. You're entirely correct. It is the amount of power. But previously, textually, it appeared as though it was identity that was the issue.
Okay.
That someone had claimed that metal as a metal mine to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we get Wax's death here, and the moment in which he pops into the cognitive realm in the Walk with Harmony. He specifies inside of this conversation, Harmony, there's a lot that goes on, but he also specifies the three parts that make up a person: body, mind, and soul, and where they go in the cosmere. The physical realm, the cognitive realm, and the spiritual realm. He divides them up and talks about the way that one being is composed of these three different components, and begins to paint this larger tapestry for how people exist inside of this universe.
Yeah, we can kind of assume that it follows the same order, but it's not necessarily explicit. He says one goes to the planet, one goes to the realm that he exists in, and one goes somewhere that he doesn't even understand. Mm-hmm. And it's, I think, assumed that the body goes to the planet, the mind goes to his realm, and the soul is entirely separate. But was there more explicit understanding of that I'm missing?
I think that it was a little bit more clear that the soul went to somewhere. Like, the soul has an afterlife, very clearly.
He doesn't know anything about it.
Yes, that's an important delineation. He knows that it exists, but he doesn't know anything about it.
Right. He doesn't know where it is. He doesn't know what's up. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. He just knows that it is. Yeah. There's a lot here to talk about from Harmony and Wax's perspective, but he also... Wax asks of Harmony the sort of quintessential God question. Why do you allow suffering? And there's this, it always kind of spirals, and it's an Ouroboros kind of thing, right? Like, how far down the rabbit hole do you go to prevent suffering in existence before you abstract choice out of the equation, right? Like, you eventually you lose free will, and that's a problem. What do you think of this conversation?
Well, I like, obviously it does devolve into that talking in circles a little bit. Mm-hmm. But I liked the overall resolution that they come to, in that he's asking about, or positing that, hey, you could make small changes and prevent the biggest problems. And his answer is, I do. You don't see them because they don't happen. But ultimately, like, I am preventing the biggest things. Like, I liked that as an end point to that conversation. because it has to stop there, because it relies on being able to see something that didn't happen, and only one of them can do that.
Right, which becomes so interesting, especially when we get into kind of the Lessie thing, the Lessie conversation that happens a little bit later here, is that ultimately he is preventing the worst of things, and that is a fascinating read on this question. It is a brilliant spin on Brandon's part to say, like, this god is doing the best that they can. It's just that you perceive, like, when I take away the worst things, your perception of the worst things changes. Your level, that bar shifts to the next worst thing until it becomes the smallest modicum of an inconvenience. That's like, why am I interceding here?
Right.
So, brilliant play. Brilliant work here. But we get to the planetary view, and we start to extract ourselves as he's kind of walking along with Wax and showing him more. We see this haze of red being blocked out by this thin atmosphere that we can kind of assume, and he even calls it like a crude depiction of like what's going on as opposed to like the actuality of what's happening, which is interesting in and of itself. But outside of that immediacy, Harmony shows Wax that he actually did give him a choice not to kill Lessie, but that this was the only rational path in which they agreed that Wax could handle this outcome and this reality, to feel good about what was going to happen, it being in his own hands, and sort of the way that he chose this path where she wasn't suffering anymore. And woof, if you thought the death was heavy, for me, it recontextualizes the killing and Alloy of Law and Shadows of Self and everything else to be like, this is a man who didn't know that it was his choice, but it was his choice, and he saw his suffering and understood his suffering and chose that as opposed to worse outcomes.
Yeah. Yeah, this is fucking heavy, dude.
Yeah.
And like, what I appreciate across this whole section is the balance that Branderson seems to be doing here of expectations versus actions. And really making things make sense, even though they're on different levels of existence. They're able to communicate effectively.
Right. It's fascinating. To get into the sort of atmospheric thing, Harmony really doesn't even know what that red is that he's protecting the world from necessarily. He can't directly see it in its nature. But there's hope back down on Scadrial as Marasi taps everything and feels supreme power flow through her. All of the powers of allomancy of old, and feruchemy all at once flooding into her. Marasi holds the power and acknowledges, despite chasing this feeling for so long and wanting to be like the Ascendant Warrior, this isn't really what she desired. This
is a conversation that I feel like we could have for hours.
Right.
I don't want to devolve into the dress again, but I feel like this fits there. Mm-hmm. Truly. Like, I feel like this just expands that conversation that we could be having about identity and desire. But ultimately, I appreciate that Marasi is able to taste that power and reject it entirely. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It feels good.
Yeah.
For some reason.
When compared to Vin didn't really have the luxury of choice. Marasi could have the luxury of choice. She could choose to pursue like possessing this power, but instead realizes that it doesn't mesh with her path. I love that you bring up the dress here, because I think that is an apt point, without getting too in the weeds, of course, as you mentioned. But I think that it's a great point, because it's a separation point for Marasi. She has the option to try on the dress and to choose whether or not she wants to wear it to begin with, wherein Vin has to have a dress, and it's a question of what's the dress blend together.
Right.
So, yeah. It's kind of my takeaway as a comparison. But, oh, man. And Marasi being the Supreme Allomancer for just a second feels good. I mean, the way that she, and Ferrochemist, she like stealing the vials and then downing them to use them feels so good. Removing some of these assumed hemalurgists from combat. It's just, it's all so cool. Such a good moment. I can imagine this
pretty dope.
Very cleanly in a TV show, or a movie. This feels great for her.
Yeah.
Steris witnesses her sister fly, and that's shocking for her, of course. Alec is struggling next to her, and she, while he is trying to communicate with her, she seems to actually be kind of working out his intent of what she's saying, and I question whether or not she's maybe breaking the language and starting to like break down what words mean. There seems to be like a little note of that understanding, but we find out that she has a secret weapon inside of her hollowed out book with a spare medallion to help our buddy Alec.
So nice.
So nice.
So good. She comes in clutch,
nice.
Obviously, being Steris. She always comes in clutch. But
Steris and clutch
I love
go hand
this. Yet again, an example of the juxtaposition of this like hyper powerful Mistborn character doing all these really intricate things and like going away, and then jumping to somebody mundane next to them, just seeing him go pew, and just like shoot away into the night. Like, okay,
fuck. Perspective is wild.
Yeah. So seeing that in the TV show, as you were just mentioning, could be hilarious.
Yeah, you can just imagine, like, in the show, I can imagine Steris going, like, scrunching up her face and throwing her arms up in the air, being like, what? And just, like, having that sort of dramatic reaction to, like, you can fly now? Like, that kind of a thing, without obviously stating it or anything like that. But, you can imagine that perplexing sort of reaction as the camera shifts. It'd be great. Exactly. It would totally work. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we end this chapter with Wax being presented with a choice as Marcy, as we know, arriving at his body. Freedom or another adventure. And Wax chooses to return to life and does what he does best. According to Marcy, as she recounts at the end of this chapter, break things with style.
Such a good summary of what he's good at.
It's so good. Because he also says, like, do what you're good at, Marcy says, and then he replies, break things, and she says, break things with style. And it's a nice little bit that's just like gives me little goosebumpies. Yeah. It's fun.
Yeah.
So good. All right, we go into chapter 29. We go to Edwarn, who sees this whole ship as an opportunity and a missing Telsin as a chance to take over her position as Sequence if she doesn't return. Then he'd be in charge of the whole series as it stood. There's quite a bit here that happens, and it's nice to get kind of what's effectively our final Edwarn POV. Technically, we get a little bit more in the end, but we get a little bit of understanding as to the set and sort of the relationship with Telsin and the way that he feels about things at large. But
a little bit, but this is specifically the section that I was talking about before, where I wanted more.
Yep.
It just feels like it feels too shrouded in mystery, and I wish we had a little bit more understanding.
I can definitely agree with that. This feels as though it is just like it. Like, I understand why you have this chapter. This chapter feels good because you get to see Edwarn's perspective. You get to see the ship take off, which is really important to like set the stage for what's going to happen when Wax shows up, and like see this sort of set piece lift into the sky. That makes sense. Set up the villain, set up that scene. We have no one else's perspective that I think you could really embody this well through. However, all of these other teases are just that. They're teases, and it does nothing but tease. And so I want to know more because I've been teased, God damn it, which I totally agree with you on. Mm-hmm. So we move from there to Captain Jordis, I think. Jordis, yeah. And it's interesting to be in her perspective comparatively, no matter how brief it is, as Alec and Steris charge in holding weapons to arm free and warm them to fight against the set. This is really crazy because it's a Southern Squadron that we're jumping into his head and kind of seeing the world and the cruelty that they're seeing upon themselves and the people around them die. It feels like a return to the old Ska perspective from the first era. Whenever we would cut to, a random ska person.
That's a good point. I wasn't expecting a new perspective entirely this late in the or in the series, or this late in this book, but I appreciated it. I appreciated the difference in point of view, looking at the characters that we'd been inhabiting for so long and seeing them from a new perspective.
Yep.
So,
yeah, it's a strong moment. I definitely agree with you. So Wax charges out, tearing around like a true Mistborn, while also considering the terrible power that he wields in these moments as he's able to bend what he feels like is reality to his will, almost, in the way that he feels he can supremely pull and push on things like he never could before. He snatches an aluminum gun and makes his way to Soot on the bridge of the airship, and they enter a standoff where the ship is wired to explode and kill them all, including the people below. After Wax says that he'll drop the bands, Soot not knowing it's the spear, they head into this interesting standoff, and we kind of cut away pretty quickly. But
this is where it's also revealed that Edwarn is holding a coin in his mouth, right?
Yes. Not only because of his speech that Kramer nails with like kind of the marble mush mouth, but also textually, of course.
Yeah, and like it's said that he's smoking a pipe, so it seems reasonable that his speech is different.
Yeah.
Which I thought was a nice touch.
Detect the coin.
Yeah.
Wax can detect the coin because of his superior allomancy.
Right, but did anything actually come of that coin?
Yeah, it's used in the end.
Okay.
So in the very end, it seems as though Edwarn could choose to pull it out and kill Wax with it, but instead what he does is he puts it between them and the ground and uses it to save them from the fall that would have killed both of them.
Right. Yep.
So it's a question of kill both of us or save us both, and I get captured. He chooses being captured. Yeah.
Gotcha.
And then, the Telson Wayne scene here at the end, this is fucking brutal. Especially if you don't, even with the out that we know that he didn't actually shoot her in the head by the end of this, but just the fact that the way this cuts away leaves it with that question of, did Wayne actually do that? But the way that Wayne is so gruff in this moment, and his language has truly shifted into a completely different, I want to say monster. It is crazed, craven. It's shocking.
It is. It's a straight up execution in the first example of it, until you learn that he assumed that she wasn't actually going to die. But I'm
not
curious.
Only that he assumed that she wasn't going to die, but that it wouldn't be what Wax wanted to happen.
Well, there's that, but yeah, that's true too. But he set out with this intention, because he grabs the gun from, like, it wasn't a sudden decision, like it wasn't a snap decision. He takes the shotgun from Wax's body,
right,
and like thinks this through and goes through with it. I'm curious if this breaks his phobia of guns going forward.
That's a good question. I don't know.
He justifies it saying, like, humorously, that shotguns don't count. But
yeah,
I'm really curious if this breaks his phobia.
I hope not, because I feel like that would be a little bit indicative of him backsliding against, like, the reason that he's afraid of guns. I can also see it on the other side where it's like he overcame the fear because he's not going to do that anymore. So I can see it both ways. But as far as keeping Wayne an interesting character, I'd prefer him not to use guns, even if it's just by choice. Maybe he keeps a gun on him, but he rarely chooses to use it.
I could
simple things like that.
I like that there is he has an out for using one now. He has a precedent set that even if he doesn't like it, it's not like Telson is banking on him not being able to use one.
Yes, right, right. It's not untenable, which until now I would have been like, he picked up a gun, but in this circumstance, it's like, absolutely he picked up a gun. He's at his dire limits. Like, that 100% makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Wax launches himself at Suit and drops all of the many hundreds of hours of weight that he has on him and eventually forces them to the ground. Suit forced to use allomancy to save both of them using that coin against the ground. It's such a brilliant move and moment in this sort of standoff in which they agree to these sort of semi-quasi-ridiculous terms. I mean, Wax is very good at this, so he can agree to it, but, like, still.
Another example of a really well-delivered line from Michael Kramer of, "I'm a ferrochemist, uncle," right before this whole sequence.
As simple as it is so impactful. And he's like, I'm that thing that you hate. You forgot that part of me that you hate, or something like that. And I'm a ferrochemist, uncle. And it's perfectly punchy.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, delicious. And there's the other line that I love here. The definition of a lawman, uncle, is easy. He's the man who takes the bullet so no one else has to.
That definition makes sense in the moment, but I feel like there's more to it than that.
Very true. Again, with a Mitch Hedberg I definitely agree with you. I think that there is more to it than that, but this is his definition that he can live by, right?
Yeah, that's fair.
The one that puts themselves in front, which he refers to himself as a lawman. He is a lawman. Wax to me truly stands as a paladin. You know, I've made that comparison in this episode, but that's because now it has become so prominent that he's unshifting in a lot of his beliefs. He's the paragon of a god. Like there's a lot that points to Wax being a Western paladin for Harmony.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true.
Yeah. All right. Milan, as she comes back, has a terrifying moment and realization as she begins to become herself again and reform. This is just a wild, unexpected moment inside of everything else that is going on. What was your takeaway? Because this is literal, like...
I mean, it's fucking insane.
It's so cool, but it's literally crazy. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's such an insane feeling. And like that would be true just coming back to consciousness, but the fact that she's also coming back to physical form. And she's like shifting
and sentience.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah. I guess I said consciousness, but consciousness, but sentience, and physical form.
I think that it's like exactly. So yes, exactly. It is that like true reformation. Like technically she's conscious, but she is, and technically a mystery is sentient, but it's that resumption of sentience and consciousness in that sort of way that it scales up over the course of writing, in addition to the physical form, that is just wow, like unanticipated, unexpected, incredible stuff. This could be kept off page and you'd be like, oh, that happened, but instead getting this like little side paragraph or two, worth it.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, pays dividends. All right. With that, we go into a really brief in my head chapter 30, as we've resolved most of the action here for the week. Marcy and Alec share chocolate, a hot chocolate. Wax saves the ship in a wonderful, grandiose fashion in which it almost appears like he has a Superman moment in which he's literally holding the ship and puts it down very gently. It is very much a Superman moment, but like it is like... Do we need to literally make Wax Superman in this moment? It's fun, I guess. I see the intrigue in doing so when you can. Yeah, what'd you think?
Yeah. The biggest thing that sticks out to me is, does this mean that they don't have sugar?
Interesting. No, I just wonder if chocolate is treated as something that's bitter and that you couldn't reflavor to make it otherwise. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, that's what chocolate is, and sugar is added to it to make it good. And like that seems to be the case here. They just added sugar.
You know, that's really interesting when you think about the lemonade as well, and sort of the reaction to the lemonade that Wax has is that it's not that they don't have sugar. It's that maybe sweetness is uncommon.
And like or only sugar, comes from
certain things, pastries,
fruits,
you know. Yeah.
Something like that it's integrated into as opposed to an extractable thing.
Interesting. Yeah. I think you're onto something there. It's not to say that they don't have it. It's that maybe they don't use it in ways that they should be, or that seem obvious to us.
Does he talk about simple syrup when he's mixing things, when Wayne is making all those cocktails?
I don't think so. He talks about sugar cubes, I think.
Does he? Okay, that
sugar
breaks
cubes.
this then.
No, I don't think it does, though. I don't think it does entirely, because it's about it being common and like mixing it with things all the time.
Okay.
So, and Wayne in and of himself is inventing things and doing things on the fly. So I'll give Wayne a little bit of a pass. And again, I want to clarify at the very least that I'm not saying that sugar doesn't exist in society. I think that it's not commonly mixed with things and mixed into things all the time. It's more of a delicacy, or, you know, intended for sweets, and you wouldn't consider it for something like a drink for the most part.
That's fair.
Or to be paired with something very bitter, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to speak for just a moment about Maricy's line about the darkness of these two men as Wax is flying around doing what he needs to help people, having been broken and died, and Wayne having come out on the other side of this, and Maricy kind of choosing her own path and having this lovely moment of reflection that she doesn't want to be like either of them with these sort of dark secrets and dark pasts, and doesn't want to walk down that to potentially be opened up to that possibility in the future. It's not the life that she wants.
Isn't this such a stark difference from where we started with Maricy's perspective on these guys as heroes?
Here's the thing.
It's so different.
Here's the thing. The book wants you to believe, the story wants you to believe that Wax and Wayne are our protagonists, our primary protagonists, our primary lens. But really, it's Maricy. Maricy is our lens for growth throughout the entire story. And I think it's brilliant in
Steris
that
a little
precise depiction. Steris as well, but Maricy is kind of first and foremost because she starts, like you're saying, idolizing these people for these things, and then graduates out of that over time as she begins to actually understand what that means and actually adjusts and changes her lifestyle as such, because she doesn't want to have that same darkness that they have. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. Oh, man. It's a moment. It's great.
It is.
There is a lot to unpack here about the crew and the negotiations, but I think it's pretty straightforward for the most part. We even talk about it more in the next chapter. It's an intense scene, and Steris really does most of the lifting here to get them out of an awful near miss of another battle that could have happened, as Wax is so bad at these kind of political negotiations, as we found out at the party and otherwise, and this is Steris' strong suit, and so it is a great moment for her to flex her character, and to also show that Wax is not omni-capable, which I think is great, because it seems like, especially after he gets this stick of power, that there's that possibility.
Yeah, I really appreciated the concessions made and the compromises that she comes up with throughout the like. It feels like a very, very fair negotiation,
right?
By the end of it.
I would agree. They do their best, all told. So there's one more thing to unpack here at the end of the chapter. As we'd mentioned before, Wayne didn't kill Telson as he picked up a major lesson from Wax. Despite his rage, he stopped himself from doing something that Wax himself wouldn't have done in the moment. Telson seems to have survived, likely healing herself with a gold mine or some such. What did you make of this sort of getaway for her and this growth for Wayne as well?
On one hand, I kind of would have liked to see that really deep change in Wayne.
Mm-hmm.
And we do in him using a gun in general, but to kill somebody for a good reason.
Sure.
Would have been the completion of an arc as well. But at the same time, I like that she survived, in that we have a lot to learn from her. We have she holds a whole lot of information, and we're going into this next book with a pretty big antagonist.
Yeah, in the form of Telson. We've traded suit for Telson in a big way. We'll talk about that in the epilogue, of course, but cool. All right. With that, we go to chapter 31, our final full chapter of the book. Just a little bit to talk about here. This feels like it would have been an epilogue in any of the other books, but we get some like stinger credits almost for our actual epilogue. But that said, we make it back to Elendel in the sky. Tensions are incredibly high in this moment as they land, and the entire world sees an airship for the first time. There's a lot of debate, like the last chapter, about who should have what, but it all pretty much pans out the way that we expect and the way that it was spoken for previously. We just get a little bit more confrontation between the political powers that be and the Southern Scadrians. Wax makes his way to Steris as they go to wake everyone as they're coming down upon the sort of scene, and they share a sweet moment that culminates in a kiss as their relationship has blossomed over the portion of this book. And it's pretty cute.
Yeah, it is cute. There's a lot of wrap up that happens here in general, to the point where I almost would have believed that this could have been the end of the era. Like there's obviously a lot of new information dropped, but it's new information that we could have explored another couple hundred years later. You know, like I would have been perfectly okay jumping into era 3 from here, given how much wrap up we get.
Sure.
Like, we obviously know right away after the book that he's working on the next entry into this era. That comes out a couple days ago for everybody listening now.
Or it's out now.
But I totally could have been okay with this being the end of the era.
Okay.
Given this wrap up.
I can see that, in all honesty, because it does actually do a pretty satisfying job of bringing nearly everything to a head outside of Trell and the societal rebellions, right? Like, those are the two remaining kind of question marks that we have. Otherwise, we've had a decent amount of character resolution on everyone's front.
Given that, I wonder if we're going to get a similar small jump like we did from Well of Ascension to Hero of Ages.
A couple of years, you're thinking?
Yeah. Where knee deep in rebellion and more of that technology has integrated into society or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I've read the first 2 chapters, so I can't say anything. Marcy gets bullied by Wayne about Alec liking her. I think this is a really kind of sweet moment that happens where like Wayne's like kind of elbowing her. And it's nice not only because like Wayne's bullying her about someone else liking her, but it's also because Wayne's acknowledged that Wax is with Steris. Like, there's a dual kind of thing here where Wayne's come to terms with it in a big way.
Yeah. And, I mean, we get to wrap it in the, Wayne's just kind of a bully kind of
yeah, right,
comedy lens. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I agree.
I would define it as, like, bullying via elbow nudge, you know?
Yeah. It's not literal bullying. It's ribbing.
Yes, yeah. Exactly. All right. Ardell did prepare what was asked, of course, for Wax on the way over, on the call over, however that was done. And we move into just a heartwarming scene where Wax asks if Steris would be willing to be his bride. And this is so sweet because it diverges from the contract. He's like, I don't want it because of the contract. We can rip that up, whatever. And it really tugs at your heartstrings as she accepts and they embrace, planning to get married this very night. She kisses him. Roll credits. That's the book.
Yeah. That's the book. I loved the line of they got a wedding. It's not our fault. It didn't result from it. Mm-hmm. Like, that's perfect. And it feeds into their both of their, or at least Steris is a fairly private person, despite her planning and despite her like
presentation
being pretty
for
adept.
Other people.
Yeah. I liked the way that this wrapped.
Yes, I would definitely agree with you. I think it's a clever way of tying in the marriage and like making it happen here at the end because it doesn't need to be this big thing, which again ties us back to Era 1 with marriages not being a big deal. Like it should be. That's true. We made this whole point at the beginning of the book about talking about the pomp and circumstance of the wedding in the survivorist fashion, and I think it's important to draw that parallel here again, where it's like. It doesn't need to be that. It's just about the 2 people.
Right.
So. All right. What roll credits? And there's an epilogue? There's 3 mid-credits stingers? Is this a fucking Marvel movie? What is
this is a Marvel movie. It's a surprise. Marvel bought the right. Disney bought the rights. And they made a movie. And that's...
Honestly, this epilogue has so much in common with Marvel stingers that like it stings for me to even make that joke because it does.
It's true.
Genuinely feel like that kind of a stinger as opposed to sort of a general vague thing that sometimes epilogues can be. But regardless, we open up with Marcy digging into research after everything she's learned as the Civil War is brewing in the background, and we see that beat as we. Maybe begin to see the outer cities have been training people. I think Bilming is mentioned in addition to another outer city. Yeah, there's trouble is brewing.
Yeah, trouble's brewing, all right. It's pretty fucking bad. Was Marcy not a part of those conversations before where Civil War was mentioned?
I think she was, but I think that this makes it more explicit, right? So it's the fact that people have been trained, and that it's extending a lot further than just the sort of political back rooms which it seemed to be trapped in before.
It's more of a real threat as opposed to an ideological threat.
Exactly. Right. Okay. Right. And the technological advances seem to point at that accelerating even faster. So we move from that stinger to Suit claiming that the set also has faceless immortals of their own, as something with red eyes enters the room and has this brief conversation with him. It claims that their timetable has changed, as has their end goal, that this planet is to be purged. It explodes and kills itself and Suit.
What the fuck, dude? It's so fucking crazy. The first impression, the first mention of the red eyes, immediately Koloss. But, like, no.
Yeah.
So I have no idea what's going on here. I'm assuming it is a different creature than the Khandra, different species than the Khandra. The way it's described, still immortal, still in the shape-shifting kind of realm, but I'm assuming it's separate from Khandra, the way it's described.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like it is, and that's why I think that he says that they have faceless immortals of their own, not saying Khandra necessarily, but saying that there's something else there, tying it in. So, that said, it literally could be corrupted Khandra, because we know that, Lessie was a corrupted Khandra, right? So, like, it could be a thing.
It could be.
But I tend to agree with you that I don't think it's necessarily corrupted Khandra. That it's something else.
And Khandra can't explode.
True.
They don't have red eyes.
So far as we're aware.
Yeah.
Maybe they've got that option. I don't know. They've got a lot of options. And our final point inside of this epilogue, Wax finally taps that coin that he was given, because he realizes that it wasn't really the coin that he thought it was, but it contained many of the same layers that he had seen previously in all of the other medallions over the course of this journey. And we see the perspective of a traveler walking among the cold of distant lands, scars layered on top of his arms, and a single haunting word spoken into Wax's mind: survive.
It's fucking chills.
Also, I forgot to write this in. Chills. Fucking chills every time. But also, we see blue allomantic lines flowing out to him from his face, not his body, not the center of his body.
He's just got a really dense head.
I think he's got a spike in his face, man. I think he's got a spike in his eye. Yeah, man. I do want to... I know that you have to go, and we'll wrap this up quick. I do want to have the brief conversation about why the Sovereign is Kelsier, because I think everyone's going to want this bit. Yeah. So, to lay it out from the groundwork as I see it, and feel free to dismantle this and we'll kind of proceed from there. Kelsier set up the temple, the Sovereign, and is the Sovereign. He set up the temple to make people think that the Lord Ruler was still alive, so they would go looking for the bracers that he is depicted as wearing and has been written in the Historica and everything else as these important metal mines. So he sets that up as a trick and a trap, because we know Kelsier is a tricky bastard. He then takes, effectively, the spear that killed him and the spear that maimed the survivor, which is an important thing inside of the religion, and tacks a new one on the end, because he's going to be the guy who knows that that's a thing, right? And so he manages, through means of which we do not know and cannot ascertain, to create the Bands of Mourning, not out of the Lord Ruler's bracers or metal mines or anything else, but in some other fashion, and imbues it into that spearhead. Not necessarily the one that kills him either. I don't think that it's quite that sort of mythical. I think it's more what worked at the time.
And I could go as far as saying that he could have done it through the power of the well, because we know he holds that at some point too, textually.
Sure. Yeah. There is that part of the conversation, and then as just an addendum to the idea that he is the Sovereign as well, not only creating the bands, but the misaligned timeline of the 30-year differential between the death of the Lord Ruler and otherwise points to him being there after the Catasandra.
Yeah.
Or showing up in those lands after the Catasandra.
Right. Yeah,
which the Lord Ruler could do.
Makes sense to me.
Yeah. So you're in on the Kelsier idea, huh? Or are you sticking with the Lord Ruler?
No, I'm in on the Kelsier idea. I think that truly makes more sense. But.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, cool. I just want to make sure that we recounted that because everyone's going to have already read the next fucking book. They're going to be tearing us a new one in the comments at this point because everyone is enjoying the Lost Metal presently.
Except for me.
Yeah, except for us. With that, next week, we are going to be releasing an episode, and I am so sorry that I maybe can't be more specific. We are either going to be talking about the first half of Secret History, or the entire thing, or the Bands of Mourning wrap-up episode. I can't tell you which it's going to be necessarily. You're safe to read the first half of Secret History. You might need to read the whole thing. It's not that much more if you need to, but we'll communicate that via socials to be a little bit more clear when we make the judgment call of what that looks like. So regardless, you've got at least 2 weeks before we start the Lost Metal. So if you want to read along, sorry, you got to wait a little bit, but if you want to read with us, it's going to be about 2 or 3 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Right. Because you've got to read it a bunch of times.
I have to at least read it twice, which is a challenge, especially because I'm hanging out with my family that I only see once a year. So, yeah, we're gonna make it happen. It's gonna happen. Mm-hmm. So that, that's as big of a pre-warning as I can give you. Again, if we do Secret History in 2 parts, it's going to be part 1 through 3 and then part 4 through 6. So that would be the way it will break up. Otherwise, it'll be all the way through and a Bands of Mourning wrap up. This is the only time that I can't really tell you, and future me wishes that they could, but unfortunately, here we are.
Too bad.
Cool. So that's where we'll leave you for this week.
Thank you, Tim and Andrew, as ever, for keeping our show's lights on. You can find all of our links in the show notes, where you can find our schedule, our Patreon, our previous episodes, websites, social media accounts, all in one convenient location.
Yes, we are so glad to have all of our patrons in here chatting with us, especially going into the launch week of such an exciting and important book. If you were able to attend the wrap-up, we were so happy to have you, and we are so glad that you showed up. Thank you for all of your support forever and always. Like PJ said, you can find all of those links. If for some reason you can't find them, Words Whiskey Pod on Twitter, Instagram, Reddit. If Twitter exists in this week, I don't know. It's been a hell of a week. You can email us if you can't find us on Twitter at wordsandwhiskeyshow@gmail.com. You can also join the Patreon and chat with us about all kinds of things, including, I think presently we're doing a First Law read along. But you can join us at patreon.com/wordsandwhiskey. And we have t-shirts on TeePublic, but more to come sooner than later. I know I've been saying this for a while, but we're closer to the screen printing thing day in and day out. We've got to practice one coming. So we'll see how that goes. Needless to say, leave us a 5-star review or Erin will come for your guts. I mean, what else do you want?
She will.
Yeah.
It's terrifying.
Cool. See you next week.
Bye.